Welcome, everyone. This is your friend, the DN What If, here with another exciting fanfiction. Today, we're diving into the story of what if Deku lost one for all and became a powerless symbol? If you enjoy this video, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more fanfiction content just like this. Now, let's get started with the fanfic. The concrete was cold on her thighs, rough texture wearing dimples into her skin. Maybe the coroner would make note of it, a tiny streak of pen in the margins to tell the police that the decision to jump had been long contemplated. An obvious case of suicide. It happened all the time, a child whose quirk wasn't good enough, powerful enough, or was just weird enough to become the focus of derision, finally calling it quits on the whole affair. Izuku Midoriya had made it longer than most. Maybe her mother would be proud that she survived middle school. At least she'd be spared the blame. They'd say if she was a bad mother, Izuku wouldn't have hit PBRY. But if Inko had been a good mother, she wouldn't have lied. She wouldn't have let Izuku hyperfocus on All Might, build a life plan around a fantasy, prepare and study as if she actually had a chance to become one of the heroes. She would have encouraged some kind of real skill, something Izuku could use, could share, could be proud of. Something that wasn't so creepy and weird that it scared off the closest thing she had to a friend. Kaken had been trying to tell her the truth. He'd been saying it over and over since it became clear she had no quirk. You'll never be a hero. You're useless. It was hard to hear those words as being cruel after the same words were echoed from the lips of the golden hero she'd admired since before she could talk. Maybe if she'd taken Kaken seriously, she wouldn't have embarrassed herself. She could have just said, "Thank you," and moved on. If she'd listened years ago, maybe right now she would be walking to a cram class on math or nursing or something useful, preparing to take a test she had a chance of passing, taking the path to a career that she had a chance in. But she hadn't listened. She'd dreamed, she'd researched quirks like something that mattered, she'd spent nights designing hero costumes, earning dark circles under her eyes with knowledge that no one would ever care to learn. And now, on the eve of her graduation from middle school, Izuku knew she was too far behind. The world was better off without her. She let herself pitch forward. The air whipped through her hair as the pavement raced toward her. Her survival instinct hit like a truck. No. She was 14. Hell, she hadn't even made it through PBRTY. There was so much time. What am I doing? The ground was fast approaching and there was nothing she could do to stop her descent. She squeezed her eyes shut. Maybe the building wasn't high enough. Maybe a hero would step in, maybe. There was no pain, much to Izuku's surprise. The air around her felt strange, charged like it was just before a lightning struck. She slowly opened her eyes, expecting to see, well, she wasn't sure, actually, but it definitely wasn't green eyes and a freckled face grinning back at her. "Hey there, sunshine." Izuku glanced around her. She was on an elevated platform surrounded by coils and bright screens. The room around her was small, just the platform and a control panel straight out of old sci-fi movies. A man sat in front of her, leaning down in his wheelchair so he could see her where she had crumpled on the ground. His face was worn, fine lines creeping around green eyes, sun spots mixing with the freckles, but disconcertingly familiar. "Hi," she said slowly. "What happened?" "Long or short version?" asked the green-eyed man. "Short. I'm you. I yoinked you out of your universe." Izuku waited for him to continue. He did not. "Okay, longer than that." The man sat up, resting his elbows on the arms of the wheelchair. "You remember those Spider-Verse movies we watched on repeat when we were younger? It's that." He paused for a moment. "Well, not really, or even a little bit, but it's a decent enough parallel." Izuku squinted at the man. "You're saying you're me?" "A version, but yeah. You're a man." "Yeah. You're actually an anomaly on that point. We're split 4-1 throughout the multiverse." Izuku finally pushed herself off the floor and sat up. She didn't believe the other Izuku, but she also didn't have an alternative theory. All of her senses told her she should be splattered across a sidewalk right now. "Okay, assuming I accept the premise that you yoinked me out of my universe, why would you do that?" Other Izuku's expression shifted to one of skepticism. "Well, if you think really hard Yeah, I tried to kill myself, Izuku snapped. What now? A different me gives me a talking to about how things will get better and sends me back. 'Cause I had that awakening on the way down and dash. I can't send you back, interrupted other Izuku, his voice clipped. He wheeled himself away from her to the control panel. He sighed, toying with a button on the panel. Strictly, according to your universe, you succeeded. In dying, that is. Oh. Well, at least she'd succeeded in doing one thing in her life. It was a cruel joke that it was her own poorly considered suicide, but hey, maybe she should take the win. If it makes you feel better, you come from a universe when your apparent suicide launches Katsuki into a stellar hero career instead of a self-destructive spiral that lands him in the dirt before he's 20. Other Izuku pointed a remote at one of the screens behind her. She turned. Kaken was sitting on the edge of the roof where she'd been moments ago, hunched over. Izuku could see he was clutching a notebook, the same one he'd scorched. She wondered how time had passed in her universe. The world looked different than it had moments ago. He looked up at the sky, saying something she couldn't hear. Izuku didn't feel the tears come until they were dripping down her cheeks. She hiccuped, unable to look away from the screen as Kaken stood, tucking the notebook under his arm and walked away from the edge. I didn't think he'd notice, Izuku sniffled. The screen turned off. He always visits your mom on the anniversary, other Izuku said. Her mother. Izuku wondered if she'd said, I love you, to her when she'd left the house this morning. She doubted it. I didn't think anyone would notice. The words sounded like an excuse. Yeah, well, depression's a lying CNT, other Izuku said matter-of-factly. Izuku startled at the harsh curse. Other Izuku chuckled. I'm sure you'll have your share of curse words too in a few years. He wheeled over, offering her a box of tissues. So you want another shot? Yeah, Izuku paused, wiping the tears off her face. But you just said I couldn't go back. Yeah, to that universe. But there are hundreds I can drop you in. Hundreds. Izuku swallowed. If there were so many, surely. Is there one where we're not born quirkless? No, that never happens. But, ever since I started doing this, a ton have formed that need another Deku. Izuku's face twisted at the nickname. Other Izuku noticed and chuckled. You'll get it later, he mumbled. He started twisting dials on the control panel. I have one that's got good proximity to your universe. Good proximity? Time runs differently in each universe, so I can't drop you at exactly the same point, but this one is only a few years off so it won't be too jarring. Other Izuku looked up from the control panel, meeting Izuku's eyes. So you in? Izuku pushed herself to her feet. The second chance. This time she was ready, no hero fantasies, no wallowing in self-pity. This time she would make something of herself. Yeah. The word felt like a vow. Q, the name Izuku Midoriya, if she even had a claim to it in this universe, had been stripped from her as soon as she signed her life away to an alphabet agency at 14, hated wearing office attire almost as much as she hated reporting to headquarters. Sure. The Navy monstrosity helped her blend into the throngs of office drones that swarmed the NPA. Sure, operational security required her to be discreet. And yet, for all the money that the agency was willing to pour into new gadgets, you would think that they would come up with a sheath dress that didn't ride up every 2 seconds. She grimaced and yanked the dress down again. Out of all the hurdles she had been forced to overcome since starting her career in international espionage, polyester was not going to be the one that brought about her downfall. In the 9 years since that day, the green-haired woman had made good on her vow. Rising through the ranks of international intelligence, Q had made a name for herself. One of only 3 Quirkless agents, Q specialized in subduing and extracting Quirk users. Pro-heroes, villains, the occasional teenager who'd lost control, she'd handled them all. She had worked alongside most heroes in Japan at one point or another, though they were rarely aware of her presence. And now this morning, as she had many mornings before, Q was walking into the office of the woman who ran international intelligence for the entirety of East Asia. Q hoped the meeting was a briefing on a new operation. Since her partner had been sent on a deep cover mission, Q had been desk-bound, looking into the increased chatter around a Quirk-destroying virus funded by the epidemic of Quirk-enhancing drags on the street. She was getting cabin fever. Q bowed slightly as she entered. "Good morning," Director said, rising up from her desk. "Thank you for coming in on such short notice." She paused, finally looking up from the tablet she had been examining. "How are you doing?" "I'm doing well." Q always appreciated Director's attempt at normalcy. "And you?" "I'm good." Pleasantries achieved, the short woman turned back to her desk. "So, your handler can send you the details, but here's the deal." She lifted a picture of a baby-faced green-eyed man. "This is Izuku Midoriya, Deku. Are you familiar with him?" Q froze for a split second before nodding. It was a dumb question, to be fair. Everyone in Japan knew about the #1 hero. When he wasn't in the news for defeating some unbeatable villain, he was doing the rounds on the news shows. People were calling him the next All Might, and that made him a prime target for all kinds of terroristic threats. He was also, of course, her in this universe's font. "Good," Director continued. "He's leading a raid on a suspected manufacturer of Quirk enhancers tomorrow. We have information that indicates that the location is connected to the chatter we've been hearing. Be there." The abandoned warehouse was cold, the kind of cold that clung to skin even through Izuku's hero suit. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh reflections off the varied selection of support items set out on card tables. Even now, almost a decade after he graduated from UA, pre-mission adrenaline thrummed through his veins. Endeavor Agency had been planning this for weeks, since Izuku had found intel that suggested the warehouse was the home to a drag manufacturing ring. They'd pulled together a solid team, mostly of old classmates. Izuku jogged in place, trying to stay awake. Night missions were the worst, as they went over the plan for the last time. "Target buildings here," Shudo said, tapping a red-circled warehouse on the satellite map. It was a few buildings down from where they'd set up to prep. "East side has the bay door. Shinso is already inside. He says that's the main load-in point and probably guarded. We breached the south wall. Fewer sight lines, fewer surprises. Midoriya and Tetsu will go in first since their quirks are the best suited for close combat." He paused. When no one spoke up, he continued. "Any questions?" Tetsu grunted his agreement as he adjusted his jaw guard. "What kind of resistance we expecting?" This was Izuku's area. "Light to moderate. It's cartel run, and they're paranoid. Expect armed lookouts and combat quirks." "I hear about 3 people near the south wall," Jair added. "Could be guards. Could be lab techs. We won't know until we're in." Shudo grimaced. "Let's wait a few minutes and see if they move on. If not, we take them down fast, non-lethal if we can. Anything else?" "Yeah," said Jairu, her face shifting into a sly grin. "Is there a reason Midoriya's other boyfriend isn't joining us or Dash?" There was a smattering of chuckles through the group. Izuku sputtered, as he always did when someone called Shudo or Kaken his boyfriend. He was sure that was why the GG had lasted this long. "Didn't you see the tabloids this morning?" Ochako chimed in. She, of all people, knew the whole thing was bullshit, but she never let an opportunity to tease him go by. "Our sweet Dynamite got his heart broken and he's leaving the Endeavor Agency to move across the country." "I feel bad," Izuku said quietly. "He'd been working for 48 hours straight when the paparazzis took that photo." Ochako rolled her eyes. "Serves him right. They never get a bad photo of him." "Guys." Jairu's voice centered the group back to the task at hand. "We're clear." The feel of the hangar changed. Every hero moved wordlessly after that, doing their final checks. Shudo gave the go signal. As they filed out into the darkness, the weight of the mission settled like a second skin. No one spoke. There would be time for talking after. The raid had started as planned. Shudo, using the ice and fire in tandem to crumble the mortar between the bricks, made quick and quiet work through the south wall. Izuku and Tetsu had managed to stick together for a good amount of clearing the building, a real feat for Izuku, let's be honest. But then, while in pursuit of one villain, a slime quirk had dropped down from the ceiling, catching them both off guard. Izuku had dodged it and given chase, as he always did, leaving the steel hero and the rest of the support team behind. Then Izuku lost sight of his target. He'd rounded a corner and come face to face with a junction where the hall split off into three. This hadn't been on the blueprints. He stood perfectly still, listening for some clue as to which direction the villain had gone. Nothing. Izuku stepped into one hallway and reached for his danger sense. Nothing. The next hall, still no. The third, a slight tingle. There was. He slunk down the hall, using float and black whip to slowly pull himself forward. He heard a shuffle behind him. He looked, but didn't see anyone. His danger sense was unchanged, so he continued on. At the end of this hall stood large double doors, steel by the look of them, locked. Well, locked to someone without full cowl. Izuku slammed his shoulder into the crack between the doors, snapping whatever locks were inside, and pushed the doors open. The room was darker than the hall, almost impossibly so. His danger sense was loud, thrumming behind his eyes. The villain was here. Izuku could only hope that they were both blind. He could hear shuffling across the room, the clink of glass on glass. Then a finger snap. The room flooded with light, burning his corneas and making him stumble back out of instinct. Izuku squinted, trying to spot the villain between the bright spots in his vision. Then his mask started to burn, like the metal had been tossed into fire. He ripped it off with a shout. There was the squeak of shoes behind him. Izuku startled. He hadn't felt any warning from his quirk. Sheet. English, that might be notable. The voice came from across the room, so there must be two of them. The room went black again. Izuku heard the squeak again and punched out hard. It landed, sending a body flying. There was a crash as glass shattered. Izuku turned toward the sound, but there was another snap and the light returned. He squinted again, searching for any movement. There was a blur beside him, about the size of Kaken. Izuku reached out with black whip to snag the figure. It caught an ankle and the figure fell. Izuku started to retract the tendril. The figure rolled onto their back, extending their arms. Izuku braced for the room to blacken again. Not that it mattered, he had them caught. A deafening crash sounded. Hot glass flew through the air. Izuku lost his grip on Black Whip as he shielded his eyes and stumbled back. His foot landed awkwardly and he slipped, barely catching himself with float. "Go, I got this," said a man's voice. The room went dark again and there was the sound of shoes scrambling on the floor. A sharp clink bounced across the floor metal on concrete, too deliberate to be random. Izuku's pulse jumped. Years with Kaken meant he knew that sound. Something hissed. Smoke filled that air. His eyes burned as if someone had poured acid behind them. Each breath scraped raw down his throat. Izuku staggered back, choking, vision swimming in watery smears. He dropped to the ground, instinct winning over logic as the tear gas filled his orifices. There was a shuffling as if someone was trying to stand, and Izuku instinctively shot Black Whip towards the sound. He wasn't sure how long it took for the rest of his team to catch up to his position, long enough that it was sure to earn him another lecture on the dangers of forging ahead. A woman's voice now, though muffled as if through a mask. "Stop it, I'm on your side." Izuku's danger sense backed up the woman's words. He felt soft hands on his face, then a cold, damp cloth wrapped over his face. "Let the heroes know Deku is at my location." The words weren't directed to him. "Tell them they'll need a medic and to get a forensics team ready, this is the place." Izuku choked out. "I gotta go." The soft hand patted his face through the damp cloth. "Keep that on. Your team will be here in a minute." There was that squeak as the voice started to leave. There wasn't supposed to be anyone else on the mission. She may be an ally, but she wasn't supposed to be there. He needed to question her. Izuku tried to stand, slipping on a piece of glass. He fell face first to the ground, landing on his side. He grimaced as he felt the sharp points of glass pierce his suit. He heard a deep sigh. "Christ, you didn't grow out of that either?" He opened his mouth to ask what the voice meant, but the world went black. Izuku felt hands shaking his shoulders. His eyes still burned and he could feel the mucus running down his face below the damp cloth. "Izuku, are you all right?" The voice was familiar, Hitoshi Shinso. Izuku was a little grateful he was the one to find him in a heap on the floor. It wasn't like he could embarrass himself more in front of the man. That ship had sailed years ago. Izuku nodded, pulling the cloth off his face. Tear gas, he choked out. The next sensation was cold water on his eyes as the other hero started to rinse the irritants. The cold water spread the burning sensation deeper into his orifices until it finally started to rinse away. Situation report? He spat as he cleared the last of the goop from his throat. 5 villains apprehended. Most of them have a history of violent crimes, but nothing that ties them to the drag trade. Hitoshi paused to help him up from the floor. Other than being here, of course. So all low-level grunts? Izuku asked, blinking his eyes to get the last of the sting out. Hitoshi nodded, then added, as far as we can tell. Okay. Izuku started to stand, looking around the huge room. It looked like the remnants of a lab, though every piece of glass had shattered. I think dash. Izuku. Izuku looked over at Hitoshi. The other man pointed toward his side. Izuku raised his arm and cursed. What he'd thought was glass had been a pile of hypodermic needles, sticking out of his side at odd angles. That wasn't good. Izuku looked back up at Hitoshi. They're probably clean, right? Katsuki Bokogu was set off, more than usual. Hated hospitals. The sterile smell burnt his nose, the 2 white lights aggravated his tinnitus, the ugly patterns on the waiting room chairs reminded him of long nights with his heart in his throat because of one dumbass or another. But what had really set him off was the specific dumbass sitting on the paper-covered bed like nothing was wrong. You're late, Deku said, not looking up from where he was swinging his legs like a kid. Katsuki leaned against the door frame, arms crossed. He hadn't even stepped inside yet. You ran into a known drag manufacturer and got yourself stuck full of mystery needles, Katsuki growled. And you're gonna open with that? Deku finally glanced up, smile small and sheepish. They said it's just precautionary. Blood work should be clean. That's not the goddamn point, Katsuki snapped, stepping inside now, jaw tight. You had backup. You had a plan. You still ran ahead like some adrenaline-jacked intern on their first patrol. Deku flinched, barely, but Katsuki caught it. This was the one situation when he wanted that reaction. He dragged a chair over with his foot and dropped into it, letting the silence stew for a moment. His arms stayed crossed, but his eyes kept drifting toward the pattern of cuts that decorated Deku's arm and the bruises blooming beneath them. How many times do you have to nearly kill yourself before you get it? He muttered, quieter now. Deku looked down. I didn't think it was. Exactly, Katsuki cut in. You didn't think. You never think, just charge in like your body's disposable. There was weight in the silence after that. They'd had this conversation 100 times now. Katsuki scrubbed a hand through his hair and exhaled through his nose, sharp and tired. Damn it, Deku. This was supposed to be my day off. Deku shrugged. You didn't have to come. Katsuki scoffed. Yeah, I did. Roki is busy cleaning up your mess and no one else is gonna yell at you properly. He stood, moving to grab Deku's chart off the wall, not to read it, just for something to do with his hands. After a second, he slapped it back into place. Doc gave you the all clear? He asked, tone a little less sharp. Deku nodded. Yeah. Just need to come back for another set of tests next week. Good, Katsuki muttered. 'Cause I don't have time to visit your dumb but every other day. He was already halfway to the door when he added quieter, plus if it had been worse, I would have killed you myself. Noted. He could hear the grin in Deku's voice. Katsuki didn't look back. Just held the door open. Let's get out of here before the paps show up. Deku hopped down from the examination table. Speaking of, I read a story this morning about you. Should I start putting out wanted ads or dash? Oh, shut the F up. It started off small. FA gene wasn't working right, as if the amount of energy he could store was getting smaller every time he reached for it. A few days later, smokescreen failed. Luckily Izuku was fighting alone and managed to avoid getting a truck to the face, but the failure scared him. Was One for All finally done with him? He'd been waiting for this day since All for One had died, but Izuku had never really expected it to come. He started keeping his head down. There was no need for him to risk anyone else's life if he was losing his quirk, but he couldn't stop patrolling altogether. Someone would notice. Danger sense was next. his dodges started getting sloppy, he was out of practice after years of depending on the quirk. Izuku could tell Kaken was starting to notice. The other hero had started insisting they patrol together, asking questions about how he felt, if he was okay, the kinds of questions the man just didn't ask. Everything came to a head a week after it began when his float started to fail mid-flight. He caught himself using Black Whip, pulling himself onto a nearby building, but the gravel rooftop hadn't been forgiving. Izuku returned to the agency with road rash and a massive new bruise. Kaken noticed immediately. "What the f did you do?" he asked. "Oh, you know me," Izuku searched for an explanation. "Just being a dumbass." That was the wrong answer. Kaken's eyes narrowed. "My office." No, Izuku knew he should tell someone, at the very least the only person that knew the truth about One for All, but he had spent too much time earning Kaken's respect to throw it away. He needed to be sure. It could be a quirk, some kind of fluke, anything else. Kaken's fists clenched. Izuku could practically see steam coming out of his ears. He braced himself for the eruption of fury. "I'm pulling you off patrols." Kaken's voice was icy. The bigger man crossed his arms, using his full height to tower over Izuku. Izuku mirrored his posture. "You can't." Kaken literally couldn't. Shudo was the final decision-maker at their agency and Izuku was sure he could convince him to keep him on the roster. Kaken sneered. "FNG, watch me." Katsuki stood outside Shudo's office. He'd been standing there longer than he'd like to admit, willing himself to step inside. FNG hated this. Deku was a grown man, ranked at the top of the charts. If he wanted to put himself in danger, it wasn't Katsuki's problem. He'd already noticed Deku's retreat. He only patrolled on daylight shifts, traded off his on-call shifts to other heroes. The nerd had been covering for everyone else for so long that he had a deep bench of people willing to take over his shifts. He was being responsible in his own way. Except Deku's concern for safety didn't extend to himself. He had no understanding of the ramifications of being a maverick. How many heroes had gone out of their way to watch his back, to make sure that when Deku was in a fight, someone was close by? Too many. Now that dumbass was hiding something. Something that was keeping him from using all of his quirks. "Bakugu." Shudo's voice drifted from inside the office. "You done with your dramatic soliloquy, or should I give you another minute?" Katsuki clicked his tongue and kicked the door open. Shudo knew him too well, it was unsettling. "We need to talk," he muttered, dropping into the chair across from the desk. Shudo didn't look up from his paperwork. "You want Midoriya on desk duty?" "He called you." "Yeah." Katsuki scowled. "You've seen it too. Something's wrong and dash." "I already tried." "Tried? It's your fucking agency. Just do it." Shudo sighed and leaned back, folding his arms. "He's already off the schedule. He was today too, you saw how that went." "Didn't even check." "What do you want me to do, hogtie him and throw him in a supply closet?" "If that's what it takes. Someone's gotta protect the nerd from himself." Shudo drummed his fingers against the desk, studying Katsuki with that unreadable look of his. "What's it been, 12 years? Hell of segue, even if Katsuki did know what he was referring to. He clenched his jaw, not biting. "Since Shigaraki," Shudo said anyway. Katsuki scratched absently at the scar on his chest. 12 years and it hadn't faded. Shudo drummed his fingers on the desk again. Katsuki could see him trying to choose his words. Finally he spoke. "Bakugu, if he was going to let you in, he would've. You've paid whatever penance you think you owed. You've been trying to carry his burdens since we were 16. You know he'll break if I don't." Shudo shrugged. "Sometimes people need to get burned to learn." His mouth twitched up a bit. "You'd know something about that. I think you're more familiar with being burned, honestly." Shudo raised an eyebrow. "You're being mean because I'm right." Katsuki grumbled, slumping in the chair. "I'm always mean." "Exactly." Shudo tapped the desk once more. They sat in silence for a few minutes. "So are you going to stop trying to be his bodyguard or dash?" "I'm leaving." Katsuki pushed to his feet, already halfway to the door. "Tell Midoriya he's off the schedule." "Do it yourself." "All right." The pause. "I've got one condition." Katsuki stopped. Which is, I'm going to tell him how you feel. Katsuki spun around and stalked back, grabbing Shudo by the collar and half lifting him out of his chair. The BSTRD didn't even flinch. He'd told Shudo about he cared about death in the sunsets and cuddles way as well as the general urge to keep him alive years ago. It was some drunken night after a mission, raw from 2 days of watching Deku and Hitoshi with all the small touches and inside jokes. Shudo had just nodded, like it was a weather update, and never spoken of since. Katsuki had been sure he'd forgotten about it. If you're going to take it upon yourself to be his savior, you might as well take your shot, Shudo said flatly. Katsuki dropped him with a growl and collapsed back into the chair, burying his face in his hands. I take that as a no, Shudo muttered. Have you even considered bringing it up? F off, icy hot. Oh, the nickname's back. This is worse than I thought. Katsuki fired off a tiny burst of sparks in his direction. Not as a threat, just an expression of frustration. They didn't even make a pop. Shudo didn't move. He just let him sit there. If you're not going to tell him, you need to move on. I fucking know, Katsuki snapped. My therapist won't shut up about it. But you can't. It wasn't a question. I don't know how. Katsuki wasn't sure he'd ever heard his own voice so small. I can't imagine not having him around, but I also can't move on with him spiderwebbed through my life. He sat back, meeting Shudo's eyes. And then there's the agency and all that legal sheet dash. Don't use that as an excuse. We would be fine. Katsuki clicked his tongue. Yeah, it was an excuse, but it was a good one, damn it. Still. I'll work on it, he said finally, like he hadn't said the same thing 100 times before. Shudo nodded sagely. So you'll tell Midoriya he's off the schedule? Do I have a choice? Of course. If you don't, I'll just go ahead and dash. Okay, fine, Katsuki sighed. Is there anything else we need to talk about? Yes. Shudo turned, pulling out a stack of folders. I need you to pick the new interns. I want the acceptance letters out before the gala next month. I hate you. You don't. I promise you I do. Shudo just smiled at him. If you say so. Izuku was going to kill Kaken. He rounded the corner, a copy of the schedule in his fist. Kaken hadn't even told him himself, just leaving a copy of the agency's patrol schedule, conspicuously lacking Izuku's name, taped to his locker. Interns jumped out of his way as he stormed towards the blonde hero's office. He must be a sight, angry tears welling up in his eyes, half-dressed in his uniform. The door was slightly open, which was lucky because Izuku wasn't sure he would have stopped to open it. The doorknob bounced off the wall as Izuku entered the room. Kaken was seated, hunched over his desk, glasses slipping down his nose. What the F is this? Izuku shouted, shaking the schedule in the other man's direction. Kaken held up a hand, one finger up. Izuku was stunned into silence for a second, then the rage roared back to life. Don't, he mimicked the gesture, me. You took me off the schedule, do you know what this will do to my ranking? Kaken hit a final key and turned to face him. As you've pointed out, I don't do the schedules, he said. I know you got Shudo to take me off. I gave him my opinion. Kaken's voice was calm, but Izuku could see his fist tightening in his lap. Roki has the final say. Izuku crossed the office so that he was only a foot away from the blonde man. Change. Back, he growled, punctuating each word with a jab to Kaken's chest. The other man stood. He grabbed Izuku's hand, his palm was hot and clammy, like he was inches away from using his quirk, and moved it away from his chest. No. It's daytime patrols, it's not like I'll get in a fight, and if I do, there'll be plenty of backup dash. Izuku, Kaken's voice was still calm as he cut him off, but Izuku could hear a growl starting to form beneath the facade. I don't care. Until your quirk is back to normal, you're not getting on the schedule. Izuku felt his chest tighten. You don't understand, if I disappear, people are going to start talking. There'll be rumors and, God, my mom is going to call and then dash. You think I care about a fucking phone call? Kaken cut in, the growl beneath his voice rising. I'm not gonna let you kill yourself because you don't want to talk to your mother. That's not what this is about. Izuku snapped. Then what is it? Kaken's composure finally snapped, voice roaring through the room. Because I swear to God, I can't keep having this same fucking argument over where I beg you to tell me what's going on and dash. Then don't. The words burst out of Izuku before he could stop them. His face was hot, eyes stinging. If you don't trust me to take care of myself, if you think I'm some lost cause, then get out. Get out of my agency. Kaken stared at him, mouth half open as if he'd frozen mid-yell. Izuku could feel those red eyes on him, picking him apart like they always did. Our agency. A chill ran down Izuku's spine. There's 3 fucking names on this place, Kaken said, low and heavy. You don't get to change that just because you're tired of me. Without letting Izuku respond, he turned, fists clenched at his sides, and slammed the door behind him hard enough to make the hinges rattle. Izuku stood there, in the middle of an office that wasn't his. He felt out of place in the worst way. The silence that followed was worse than the yelling. Izuku stood frozen in the center of the room, staring at the door Kaken had disappeared through. The walls still echoed faintly with his voice, raw and furious, and Izuku could still feel the heat of it clinging to his skin. He wiped at his face with the back of his sleeve. It came away wet. What the hell was wrong with him? His breathing was shallow, chest tight. The same looping thoughts had started circling again. It was over. His career was over. He was going to lose his quirk. He shoved them away. No, it wasn't over. He'd figure out what was going on and fix it, and then Kaken wouldn't have to worry about him anymore. Till the day he died, Izuku would say that he'd really tried not to get into the fight. He'd gotten up and left Kaken's office. He'd put on his civvies and left the agency to go home. He definitely didn't wander directly into the area where a villain had been mugging people, and if he happened to be wearing his Air Force gloves, it was just because he'd forgotten to take them off. Besides, how he got there was a moot point. The real issue was that he was currently flying through the air. Unwillingly. One moment, Izuku had been dodging, sprinting, trying to bait the villain into the open. The next, there was a shockwave loud enough to shatter eardrums, and then there was nothing beneath him. Wind howled past his ears as he plummeted, limbs flailing on instinct. The sky spun above him. The ground rushed up to meet him. He gritted his teeth. He needed Black Whip. His fingers twitched, muscle memory kicking in. Nothing. No flicker. No snap of power in his core. No thread of energy to catch on. Just air. Just gravity. His heart dropped faster than he did. Not now. He'd used it just this morning. There was no way it was gone. He tried again. Screamed it in his mind, begging, pleading, clinging to it. Still nothing. The panic set in, the adrenaline drowning out the pain in his shoulder. His breath hitched. His body knew how this was supposed to go. How many times had he caught himself midair, let the quirk take over like a sixth sense? But there was nothing there. He was really falling. Oh no, not now. The city blurred below, angles and steel and inevitability. He was twisting through the air. He couldn't even move into a position that would slow his fall. Something in his shoulder wasn't right. His arm wouldn't move. The buildings merged into each other. His thoughts scattered. There had to be heroes close by. There had been at least 3 reports of this guy. One of them had to have a quirk that could help. The wind tore past him, screaming in his ears. He could see the cracks in the pavement. He tried again, screaming as if the quirk could hear his pleas. Nothing. The ground rushed up, unforgiving. Crack. A wall of ice erupted beneath him, jutting upward to meet him. He hit it hard, feet first. He could hear his shin crack. He bounced, then skidded sideways down a sharp slope of frost. The world tilted for the last time as he tumbled off the edge into an out-of-season snowbank. He landed on his side, more like a dropped ragdoll than a hero. Air came shallow and quick. He was pretty sure one of his ribs had punctured a lung. His fingers dug uselessly into the snow, and his vision was dark at the edges, the pain making everything flicker. He heard the sound of boots hitting pavement. A hand pressed to his back, not harsh, but firm. Checking for spinal injury, Izuku registered, hazily. Cool fingertips brushed his neck. Midoriya. Can you hear me? Shudo. Izuku blinked hard, trying to focus. The other man's face hovered above him. His expression was stony. "You're injured. You need to stay down." Izuku coughed. It felt wet. He hoped that wasn't blood in it. "Didn't see you," he rasped. "Bakugo noticed you left with your gloves and called me. I figured you were getting into trouble." Izuku heard rustling, then the feel of a jacket being tucked under his head. Shudo's voice stayed steady, but Izuku thought he could feel his hands tremble. "You're stupid lucky that he noticed. The next closest hero was 2 blocks away." Izuku tried to laugh. It came out broken. "You always do this," Shudo murmured, almost too quiet for Izuku to hear. The cold was starting to numb the worst of the pain, but his body knew it wasn't good. Something was torn, cracked, maybe worse. He hated this, feeling useless. Shudo knelt beside him, hand already glowing with a faint, stabilizing heat. "Ambulance is 2 minutes out," he said. "You're gonna be okay." Black spots filled his visions and, for once, Izuku didn't try to fight the darkness as it swallowed him. His stillness was a testament to his therapist. Katsuki tried to focus on his breath, the texture of the hospital wall against his back, the chill of the floor on his legs. The image of Deku falling through the air, plummeting to the concrete, was stuck to the back of his eyelids. In 2-3-4, hold 2-3-4, out 2-3-4. Deku was going to be fine. In 2-3-4, hold 2-3-4. There was nothing he could do right now. In 2-3-4, hold 2, he'd F it up. He should have known Deku would do something like this. He should have stuck close to him instead of storming off like he was 16 a guy. Katsuki exhaled hard enough to interrupt his own thoughts. Deku was going to be fine. Wow, breathing exercises? You should be paying that therapist more. Katsuki groaned, opening his eyes to stare at the ceiling. "You look like sheet," Shudo added helpfully. "Blame your boyfriend," he muttered, not getting up. "I thought that was you this week," Shudo said. Katsuki ignored the twist in his stomach. "F off, I'm not claiming that idiot." He noticed that the other hero was still wearing his uniform. "Where've you been?" "I know you had to give a report, but dash. I was finishing my patrol." Of course Shudo would finish his patrol. They both knew Deku was going to be in surgery for hours, wasn't anything either of them could do. Heroes like them didn't take leave because a teammate got injured. There was too much to do. Bakugo. Hearing his name pulled him back out of thoughts. Shudo was offering him a ratty old duffel with a familiar X embroidered on its side. "You breaking into my office now?" Shudo's expression didn't change. "I used my key." He paused, looking down at the bag and then to Katsuki, his expression suggesting he had a question he wasn't sure he could ask. Katsuki had to guess what it was. "Why do you keep a change of clothes for Deku in your go bag?" "'Cause Deku refuses to pack one," Katsuki said, pulling the duffel out of Shudo's hands and onto his lap. "Isn't that his problem?" Shudo asked. Katsuki shot him a glare, mostly out of habit, and chose to ignore the question. It had barely been a day since the conversation in Shudo's and he still felt raw. He changed the subject. "The new PR extra dash." "JJ," Shudo corrected. "JJ handling the vultures okay?" Shudo shrugged. "You know how it is. Number 1 hero injured, condition unknown, is a hell of a headline, so they're being pushier than usual." The man's tone was as flat as usual, but guilt still sparked in Katsuki's chest. This whole mess was his fault. If he'd done what he'd known he had to do, then there would be a flock of press descending on their agency and... "Don't." Katsuki grimaced, his inner monologue was showing. "Don't what?" "Don't go and try to save her from the press corps. This is exactly why we hired her." Shudo crouched, meeting Katsuki's eyes. "Plus, you'd probably end up making a bigger mess of it." Change the headline to, "Dynamite jailed after reporter suffers third-degree burns." Katsuki shrugged. He was pretty sure Shudo was teasing. The other man had that almost imperceptible quirk at the corner of his mouth that he insisted was a smile, but he also was probably right. He really wanted to punch someone, and a too rough reporter sounded like a good excuse. That'd be fine. Get the focus off Deku. The smile disappeared as Shudo's lips pressed together. He sighed and rose out of his crouch. Katsuki could feel a repeat of the previous day's conversation coming. It didn't. "You should change," Shudo said, gesturing to the bag at Katsuki's feet. If he wakes up to you in uniform, he might have another heart attack. Yeah. Katsuki stood stiffly. He'd been on the floor too long. He'd seen a bathroom by the nurse's station. It should be fine if he stepped away for a few minutes. When he turned back, Shudo was already starting back down the hall. Hey, Katsuki called after him, you didn't ask how he's doing. Shudo turned back slightly. You're doing breathing exercises in the hallway, Bakugu. I didn't really need to. The words were, as always, a mere statement of fact, but they rang in Katsuki's ears like a reprimand. Katsuki started, then swallowed his words. What was he supposed to say? Sorry about the extra work, but if I leave and he dies, I'll throw myself off a roof and I'd rather not? It sounded stupid and desperate, even in his own head. A looming sense of dread was no reason for him to be off duty. Even if Deku was dying, there wasn't anything he could do about it. It's okay. Shudo turned back to look at him for a moment. Keep an eye on him for me. Mr. Bakugu? Katsuki turned. An unfamiliar nurse waited by the nurse's station. The doctor would like to speak to you. I'll be right there, he said, grateful for an excuse to leave his sentence unfinished. I just need to change first. Katsuki had expected the nurse to lead him to Deku's room, but instead he led him through windowless hallways, past locked doors and a security checkpoint, to a cold, gray office. A vaguely familiar woman stood from behind the desk. Katsuki guessed she was from the bureaucratic side of the commission, pretty high up on the food chain judging by her suit. He could recognize his mother's designs anywhere. Dynamite, she started. Definitely commission. Would you like to take a seat? No thanks, he said. The woman paused, appearing to assess him, then walked out from behind the desk. Leaning on the edge of the desk, she clasped her hands and let out a deep sigh like a teacher who was disappointed in his test score. Okay. She pursed her lips as if considering her words. Deku has completely lost his quirk. Katsuki's stomach dropped. The heart rate that he'd been trying so hard to control started to pulse in his ears. He'd known something was happening with it, but for it to be completely gone? Currently, the woman continued, it's unclear if his state is temporary or permanent. There isn't exactly a reliable test for this. There were more words after that, but Katsuki couldn't hear them. Deku lost one for all. His ears whined like he'd stood too close to one of his explosions. The most powerful quirk in existence had disappeared into thin air, along with it his entire life. The agency whose reputation they'd built back up from the ground on. Deku was the big draw, and without him, the steady stream of sponsors they'd won over wouldn't exactly stick around, and without that, it would be a stretch to keep up with the rent in a few months, let alone payroll, malpractice insurance. The sound of fingers snapping pulled Katsuki out of his thoughts. Dynamite, please pay attention, the woman said sternly. This information is need to know. The commission cannot allow the press to know that Japan's #1 hero has been rendered quirkless. How long do you think you guys can keep this under wraps? The woman raised a single eyebrow. He could hear his tone. His anger was seeping in. Katsuki paused, taking a breath. The press will notice if they stop seeing him on patrols. He chose to ignore that pulling Deku off the street had been his plan not 12 hours ago. Whatever they come up with will be worse than this. Deku will continue performing his duties. We've arranged a protective detail for him and Dash. You put Deku on a patrol, he's not going to play it safe, protective detail or not, Katsuki cut in. The woman's face twisted like she'd bitten into a lemon wedge. She stood, brushing off her skirt as if a fleck of dust would have dared to land on it. I'm sure Deku will follow the commission's directive, she said slowly. Insubordination is a revocable offense and he wouldn't want to risk his license. The threat in her voice turned Katsuki's blood to ice, snuffing out the last flickers of his anger and leaving only a heavy, sinking dread. This wasn't a conversation. You should know better. The woman settled back behind the desk. The way she looked at him made his gut twist, like he'd wandered too close to something with teeth. The protective detail will be headed by an agent from an international organization. They think that Deku's condition is connected to one of their cases. She tossed a file across the desk. That's the mission brief. Read it. Katsuki gritted his teeth. Yes, ma'am. The darkness retreated in fragments. First, a bright blur overhead. Then the hums and clicks of machines, the steady beep of something close to him, too close. His mouth was dry, painfully so. It always was after surgery. His right arm was immobile, tightly held in some kind of sling. His whole body hurt. There was a familiar twinge in one of his shins that spoke of a bone that had been healed, and he could feel at least one recently broken rib on his side. Izuku forced himself upright, blinking hard to clear the fog. In the corner of the hospital room sat Kaken, hunched over a laptop. His clothes were rumpled, pulled straight from his go-bag, and one side of his hair was flattened. The dark circles under his eyes were almost impressive. Guilt fluttered in Izuku's chest. They hadn't exactly been on speaking terms that morning, and now Kaken was playing nurse again. What happened? Izuku rasped. Everything after he'd left the agency was fuzzy. You fell, Kaken replied curtly. He gestured to a cup on the bedside table. Drink some water, you sound like sheet. Izuku complied. It was lukewarm, which meant he'd been out for a while, but it soothed his throat nonetheless. Why am I still here? He asked, his voice sounding more like his own. Morning light was creeping in through the blinds. He must have slept through the night. Shouldn't they have kicked me out by now? Doc will be by to explain it to you, Kaken said quietly, not looking up from his screen. A shiver ran down Izuku's spine. Something in his tone was that soft. A tone that had only ever been directed at him once before, when Recovery Girl had pulled herself out of retirement to fix his spine. Kaken, what aren't you telling me? Your blood test, he replied. They found something off. Doc's being cautious. But caution wasn't what Izuku heard. He heard warning bells. There was a knock on the door. Kaken closed his laptop with quiet finality. Guess who's up, Doc? A woman in scrubs walked in. She looked nervous, eyes darting between him and Kaken. Still she smiled. Hello, Mr. Midoriya. I'm Dr. Archer, your attending physician. I wanted to talk to you about your condition. Yeah, I don't really remember what happened. I fell. Her eyes darted over to Kaken, as if surprised by this. He'd known it was a lie. She picked up his chart and swallowed. Yes, she said. Due to your injuries, we pulled a routine blood panel. However, when we compared your current blood work to the results from last week, there were some anomalies. It seems you were infected with some kind of retrovirus. We've sent it to a specialist for analysis, so we're hoping that once we understand it better. Izuku started to tune her out. He felt bad about it, but he just wanted to go home, to his own bed. He was so tired, more tired than he'd felt in years. He hadn't felt this tired since before One for All. The memory came back to him in a rush. The wind rushing around him, reaching for Black Whip, the emptiness that sat where his quirk had been. He raised his good hand and tried to summon his quirk. A small spark of green lightning danced across his palm, but faded almost immediately. I can't feel it, he whispered. The words tasted like ash. Dr. Archer seemed to steel herself. Kaken stood. Doc thinks the quirklessness could be temporary, he said. His posture was that of a man stepping willingly into the path of an explosion. They were going to take some time to make sure that they knew more because I'm quirkless. Izuku hissed. Kaken didn't blink. Because there was concern about how you'd react. And your solution was to lie? His voice exploded out of him. Doc, can you ? Kaken nodded toward the door. The doctor didn't hesitate. As soon as the door clicked shut, Izuku's fury surged like a wave with no shore. It was your idea, he growled, voice low and venomous. To keep it from me. Izuku Don't use my name like that, he shouted, fists clenching around the hospital blanket. You think I can't handle this? I've lived through worse, Kaken. I've broken every bone in my body for One for All. I know. Kaken's voice was maddeningly calm. Izuku seethed. You don't get to play the rational one. Not after all the times you lost your demon mind over nothing. But I lose my quirk and suddenly you're the poster boy for emotional stability. You're spiraling. I'm angry, Izuku bellowed, shaking with it. I'm allowed to be angry. I gave up everything to become the #1 hero, everything, and now I'm back to being a useless, quirkless Deku. The word echoed. Kaken's jaw tightened. You think I don't see it? Izuku snarled. You're relieved. Admit it. You never thought I was worthy of one for all. Silence. Kaken stared at him, and for a second Izuku waited for the explosion, the yell, the slam, the flash of heat. Instead, he saw something worse. Pity. So much pity that Kaken didn't even rise to the bait. He didn't want Kaken's pity. He wanted him to scream, to match the storm inside him. But Kaken just stood there, like someone had taken all the anger usually in him and shoved it into Izuku. You obviously need time, he said, voice tight. I'll let you get some rest. Izuku glared at him as he left, hoping he could feel the fury burning against his back. Phew, he spat. Kaken's only retort was the door slamming shut. Q was summoned back to the agency a little less than a week after the raid. It was unexpected. When she'd handed off the samples she pulled from the warehouse lab, Handler said she would be doing desk work until further notice. She shuffled in the elevator, playing with the hem of her blazer. Something told her this meeting had a lot to do with Hero Deku's accident last night. Q was almost positive his fall had been caused by complete Quirk failure. If the Quirk-destroying virus was already in play, there were about to be a lot more accidents. The elevator doors slid open and she was greeted by a familiar set of dark circles. Q, growled Aizawa, peering over his scarf. His eyes were more tired and his skin looked even paler than usual. I'm glad you made it. Mr. Aizawa, she smiled softly, bowing slightly as she stepped out of the elevator. It's wonderful to see you again. He turned and headed for the stairs that lead to the second level of the bullpen with a grunt. Q followed him towards director's office. Aizawa didn't appreciate any form of small talk. She glanced over the railing toward her handler's desk, hoping for some kind of signal regarding why Aizawa was greeting her out of the elevator, but his chair was empty. No pre-op briefing, no handler. Whatever this was, it was serious. Luckily, Handler was waiting in director's office. The tall man always soothed her, an almost Pavlovian response that came from years of working together. He had been her handler since she'd started working at the agency, and he had never let her down. Handler looked up from the folder he'd been examining and smiled reassuringly as Aizawa closed the door behind them. They all stood quietly for a moment, waiting for someone to speak. Director clapped her hands and stood. Hero Deku has lost his quirk, Director said, skipping the pleasantries this time. We don't know if it's permanent or not, but it is via a mechanism we've never seen before. Definitely the virus then. Given his reputation, the Commission believes there are many parties that might try to finish him off now that he's lost his quirk. Q's eyebrow twitched. A pro-hero needing a bodyguard wasn't new, but they rarely got agents as bodyguards and they certainly didn't get assigned to her. Director looked over. The Commission doesn't want to broadcast his vulnerability, so you and Jay will be assigned to blend in and keep him safe until we have a better handle on the situation. Q grimaced internally. Bodyguard assignments were far from difficult. She'd had a few at the start of her career, but pro-heroes were among the worst clients. Plus, she was betting this Izuku wasn't any better than she was at following stay put and rest orders. What's my cover? She asked, her voice just as neutral as it had been moments before. Asuka Midoriya, Handler answered. Given your familial resemblance, it should be no issue for you to pass as a family member. No sheet she could pass as his twin. We'll keep it simple, first cousin from his father's side. They're printing off your ID packet as we speak. We'll keep your given name as your usual alias since some of the pros already know you as that. Q nodded. So, if that's it, she said slowly, why is Mr. Aizawa here? It wasn't unusual for the pro-hero to come in for briefings on villains or crime organizations. He was basically the agency's liaison for the various hero agencies. It was, however, extremely rare for him to come in for something as simple as this. She glanced over at the man, slumped against the wall, glaring at the carpet. Mr. Aizawa is concerned regarding Hero Deku's willingness to cooperate, Director explained. He wanted to be there to make introductions. Since this is a relatively simple job, I didn't see the harm in allowing him to sit in. You'll still be reporting to me, however, said Handler. Mr. Aizawa is just here to smooth the transition. Q nodded, more to the subtext than the words themselves. Her superiors weren't going to tell the hero agencies that the agency had been tracking the chatter about such a virus for the past year, and keeping Aizawa out of the room for something as simple as this mission appeared to be would R's suspicion. "I appreciate the help," she said, beaming. "When will I be meeting Hero Deku?" "Right after you stop by support to get geared up," Handler headed toward the door. "This might be long-term, so we'll be providing you with luggage and other essentials appropriate for your cover." Q bowed to Director and turned to go with Handler. Aizawa moved as if to leave with them, but Director called him back to her desk. "Mr. Aizawa, could I borrow you for a moment?" she asked. "I have a few more details to cover with you." The real briefing started in the support department, safe from Aizawa's eyes and ears. Mei Hatsum, recruited into intelligence the day she graduated from U, greeted them with her trademark manic energy, shouting "Q" from across the room as she bounced into the agent's arms. The woman had never fully understood the notion of personal space, but Q didn't mind. Sit down," she chirped, shoving Q onto the waiting bench. "How have you been? I heard you got stuck on desk duty. How is that?" "I've been fine," Q said, watching Mei careen around the workshop fondly. "Desk duty SEKS as much as usual." Handler cleared his throat. Q rolled her eyes, he knew damn well she wasn't made for desk work, and turned to the man. "Director said Jay would be with me on this mission, but I heard he's still undercover." "Jay? I thought you knew me better than that," a warm, familiar baritone drawled from the entrance. Jay, better known by his favorite alias, Carter, her career-long partner, almost family at this point, was leaning casually on the door frame. The tailored suit hung loose on his lanky frame, his curls flopped into tired eyes, and his whole presence screamed that he hadn't slept in days. He looked like he'd just survived a month-long stakeout in the sewer system. Or an international flight in coach, same thing. "Carter!" Mei hurtled from the back like a pink and black tornado. She leapt, arms outstretched. He caught her easily, spinning her around. "Hey Chu," he said as he set her back on the ground. "Still blowing up government buildings?" "Oh, constantly," Mei said, reluctantly letting go. "More importantly, what have you been up to? You were under so long I thought you'd gone native." "Can't talk about it," Carter replied, fingers twitching at a button on his jacket. His tone was breezy, but Q caught the flicker of something darker beneath. Mei pouted, opening her mouth as if to argue, but Carter didn't let her. "Even you don't have the clearance for this one." Mei's eyes narrowed. "I have clearance for everything." "Not this," Carter said, just a little too quietly. "Go and try. Operation Centerboard." With a dramatic sigh, Mei stalked to the nearest terminal and typed. The computer beeped in refusal. She typed again, faster. Beep. The silence was uncomfortable, even the machines above seemed to hush. Q traded a glance with Carter. The operation must have been bad. Mei huffed loudly. "Ugh, why do you always get the exciting ones?" Q could see relief cross Carter's face as he relaxed. "What can I say? I'm an exciting guy." "All right." Mei dropped her pout and clapped her hands, her signal that it was time to return to business. "So, what's the plan?" Carter asked, settling down next to Q on the bench. Handler pulled a case file from beneath his suit coat. "You're both aware of the chatter around a group in possession of a virus that renders the infected quirkless. It looks like the recent raid took out their main lab." He handed the file to Carter, who started paging through it immediately. If Q had to guess, he wouldn't hear a word Handler said from here on out. "Your primary job is finding out who produced the virus, and what their current resources are. Try not to put the protectee in danger unnecessarily, but keep in mind he's the best bait we have." "Do we actually think he was targeted?" Q asked. "No. It looks like he was exposed by some dirty needles during the warehouse raid." Handler looked at Q pointedly. "It seems he tripped and fell into them trying to follow an unknown friendly." "Huh. It wasn't her fault he tried to follow her. So why would the group go after him now?" "We believe that the warehouse contained the only copy of the virus. Since most everything was destroyed, they may need a new sample. Q will play primary for the commission, since she has the familial cover. J will be in charge of the agency's investigation." Handler turned to Carter. We set you up as an assistant at the Protectees agency, so you'll have access to surveillance and crime reports. Carter finally tuned back into the conversation and closed the file. Sounds simple enough. I think so, Handler said, slapping his thighs in that weird way he did instead of saying goodbye. You know how to find me if you have questions. Once he was gone, the room settled. Carter and Q paged through the file in silence until May returned, a small bag of tech in hand. So, she said brightly, laying out devices, who's the lucky client? Deku, Carter said. Pro hero. Lost his quirk recently. May's face scrunched up. Deku. Yeah, I remember him from UA Sweet Kid. Tried to recruit him to support once. He said something about blowing up my babies. Her hands paused on a device as she looked over at Q. Isn't that going to be weird for you? May had been one of the many scientists assigned to check Q out when she arrived, so she was one of the people that knew the story behind Q's strange origin. Q shrugged. I don't think so. I mean, it's not like we're the same person anymore. You're more similar than you'd think, said May. Regardless, I'm sure he's still a sweetheart. You're going as Asuka, right? Yeah, I'm going under as his cousin. Makes sense. May grabbed a wheelie stool and started rolling over to them. Hey, are you gonna see Shinso while you're in town? I know he and Deku are still pretty close. Q felt her ears heat up. She'd been a fan of Nighthide since the start of his hero career, entirely because heroes with mind-based quirks were rare and not because she was 16 and thought the whole mask thing was hot. Because this universe was particularly cruel, when she'd gotten transferred to Japan 3 years ago, Nighthide had been the hero contact on her first operation. Running an op next to her teen crush was a fun experience that she would have preferred never to repeat. But, of course, the universe didn't let up. Nighthide's quirk was perfect for intelligence work. He showed up on assignments more than most heroes. The Japanese government might prefer to keep his quirk on the front lines, but the agency was far more flexible when it came to interrogation techniques. Worse, the man was actually prettier. You can't call lashes like that handsome in person, so it had taken a few tries to get over the butterflies. But that was years ago, and these days Q was a consummate professional. It wasn't her fault Hitoshi Shinso, the person, was a decent man and great at his job, and if she preferred to take operations with his name on them, that was the only reason. He's not mentioned in the brief, Q said. Again, consummate professional. Oh, do I get to play wingman? Carter's grin was so wide Q could hear it. Oh my god, yes. May grinned as she rolled in front of them, a tray of what appeared to be thick contact lenses on her lap. She centered herself on Q. You want to go with the usual? Yeah, Q said. May selected a brown lens. I don't know why, your eyes are so pretty. Q sighed. It's a distraction. If someone is asked to ID me, the main thing they'll remember is that I have heterochromia. May leaned over, catching Q's eyelids between her fingers with practiced ease. What's your distraction, Carter? None, he said flatly. I'm terminally unremarkable. Q barked a laugh as May leaned back and scooted over to do his lens. That's one way to put it. Lenses in place, May sat back, inspecting their eyes. You're both good. No fancy toys this time, though I've been told you're on standard issue only. Oh, thank God, Carter muttered. His smirk didn't fade when May flicked his forehead. Awaza was waiting outside of support when they finished with May. Q'd almost expected him to try to run off and find a place to nap, but perhaps he knew better than to wander around unaccompanied in a secured area. Ready? Grunted Aizawa. Q nodded. Carter had already gone ahead to check the prep of the apartments. Hiro Deku's place had needed to be swept, and their equipment had to be set up in another, so she was going to pick up alone. Q adjusted the bag on her shoulder as they walked towards the elevators. So, is there anything I should know about my new cousin? She asked. He's a good kid, Iwaza muttered. His quirk is really important to him, so it's going to be a rough couple days. They'll be giving him the news soon. Oh, he's going to be mad, Hugh said. He'll handle it well. I've known him his whole hero career. He doesn't get angry too often. Q chewed the inside of her cheek. She knew how she'd react to getting her greatest wish torn away. Unless this version had spent a solid amount of time in therapy, Aizawa was massively underestimating his reaction. But hey, maybe she was wrong. There had to be some universe where Izuku Midoriya's had their sheet together. The room was too quiet now. Without Kaken to yell at, reality set in. It was really gone. Izuku stared at his palm, searching for a spark of one for all buried in his chest. His jaw clenched so tightly it ached as sweat gathered on his upper lip. Nothing. In one day, he dropped from the number 1 hero back to the Quirkless kid on a rooftop. Izuku let himself fall back onto the bed. He stared up at the ceiling, searching for something that didn't belong. A glimmer, a flaw in the paint, any tiny detail that would shatter the illusion and prove this wasn't real. Izuku had to be dreaming because if this was reality, then he'd lost everything. His work, his agency, his ranking. The sense of satisfaction that came with a successful mission, the stares of wonder as he stepped out on patrol, he'd never feel them again. Worse, there was no one else to blame. The doctor said it was a virus. If he'd reported his symptoms earlier, maybe he would have been able to keep a quirk or two. But he hadn't. So he searched the ceiling like a man begging for an escape hatch, willing it to twist, shift, dissolve. It didn't. Hello, Midoriya. Izuku jumped at the sound of his old teacher's voice. How are you feeling? Aizawa asked, more gruff than usual. He was standing by the door as if waiting for an invitation. Izuku swallowed. He didn't know how to answer that. Fine, I guess. But Kogu said you were in a mood, Aizawa said, walking into the room. Of course he'd checked in with Kaken first. As he walked in, Izuku noticed the woman behind him had stopped short of entering, standing just outside like she was waiting for something. He didn't recognize her, but she looked familiar somehow. He's the one that stormed out of here, Izuku said flatly, turning his attention back to Aizawa. The older hero raised an eyebrow and glanced toward the door. As if on cue, Kaken stepped back into the room, a chip bag crumpled in his hands. To everyone else, it probably looked like he'd only ducked out for a snack. He walked around the woman in the doorway and leaned back against the wall, avoiding Izuku's gaze. Everyone's here, Aizawa said. The woman stepped inside and bowed slightly in greeting before turning to close the door. I'm Asuka, it's nice to meet you all. Izuku looked her over, eyes narrowing slightly. She was about his height, maybe just under. Shoulder-length green hair tied back, freckles scattered across a face that looked too calm for his liking. She wore her clothes loose, but they didn't hide the athletic cut of her frame or the way she carried herself. She was at the very least combat-trained. Then he saw her eyes. One brown, the kind of chocolate shade that made him think of Uraraka. The other green. Not just green, his green. That made something twist low in his stomach. No visible weapon. No stiff lines under the fabric. Nothing that announced her as a threat. Aizawa and Kaken had let her in, and any other day that would be enough. Today, however, he was quirkless. The woman shifted uncomfortably under his gaze and he realized he'd been staring. He glanced between Aizawa and Kaken, waiting for an explanation. Asuka is from outside the commission. She'll be watching over you until we know more about the nature of the attack, Aizawa said. Her cover is that she's your cousin. The commission doesn't want your condition getting out, and a top 10 hero suddenly being surrounded by bodyguards would definitely raise some eyebrows. The agent smiled reassuringly. I understand if you have some reservations about being guarded, but I can promise I will have as little effect on your daily life as possible. Izuku ignored her, not looking away from Aizawa. Why is some mystery agency getting involved? Why not assign me Shudo or another hero? He could see Kaken shuffle out of the corner of his eye. As Mr. Aizawa said, the commission wanted to keep your condition as quiet as possible and, given your status, believe that having you constantly accompanied by another hero, even someone you work with regularly, would bring too much attention, the agent answered, seemingly unbothered by being ignored. Izuku sighed. Better than having to take another hero off the street, I guess. I'm useless like this. He turned to address the agent. So what's your quirk? I want to know what I'm working with. I'm perfectly qualified to protect you, she answered, dodging the question. Your apartment has already been swept for bugs and cleared. So, if we're all in agreement, I'd like to move you there. Izuku nodded. I'll wait outside the door while you change, then we'll leave together. Remember, if anyone asks, I'm your cousin. Izuku nodded. From my father's side, I'll remember. Excellent. The agent smiled reassuringly. I'll meet you outside. Izuku stood up, yanking off the sling. He was sure his shoulder had healed enough, and started digging through the old duffel bag sitting by Kaken's chair. He always had an extra set of clothes for him in there. Usually anytime Kaken wasn't going home, Izuku wasn't either. Aizawa was watching him suspiciously. You were a lot easier to convince than I thought you'd be, he said. I know it's the only way Kaken will leave me alone. Izuku lied as he gingerly took his shirt off and tossed it into the bag. Without his quirk, he couldn't risk pissing off the commission, and if this bodyguard was sent from them, he wasn't about to ruffle feathers by refusing. But he wasn't going to admit that. Kaken sked, rolling his eyes. Plus, she seems fine, Izuku added politely. Fine doesn't mean sheet if you're under attack, the blonde hero growled. I'm not convinced she'll be much use in a fight. Aizawa shrugged. I've worked with her before. She's good at what she does. Maybe she'd be willing to spar with you, Izuku said as he emerged from his t-shirt. The agent obviously didn't want to tell him her quirk, but watching her fight would make it apparent. Kaken shrugged noncommittally. Maybe. I'd pay to see that, Aizawa muttered from the corner. Izuku glanced over at his teacher as he hopped into his sweatpants, his shin twinging. That was high praise coming from Aizawa. Kaken pushed himself off the wall. I'm betting she'll just get in the way. Oh, she'll definitely get in the way of your usual antics, Aizawa said. Deku is an important symbol and the government wants to make sure they don't lose him. It's barely been a decade since All Might's. He paused, swallowing. Since the commission is still pretty concerned about anything that might undermine the public perception of heroes. Izuku knelt to tie his shoes, glad his face was out of view so neither of the other men could see the worry on it. Keeping the public feeling safe was almost more important than actual hero work. But as far as his worth as a symbol went, there was always another hero waiting in the wings to take on his role. Hell, Kaken would probably be one of the top choices, a natural successor in a way, if he never got his quirk back. Oi, this, said Kaken, looking down at him, his eyes creased with something like worry. You forget how to tie your laces or something? No, just thinking. Izuku stood. I'm ready to get out of here. Aizawa crossed his arms. Put the sling back on. Izuku huffed but did as he was told. The agent had already made friends, Izuku noticed as the three of them stepped out into the hallway. She and his nurse were chatting happily as they stood across from the doorway to his room. Midoriya, said his nurse, you didn't mention you had a cousin. Izuku forced his face into a smile. Yeah, I forgot she was coming into town, what with everything. He gestured to his sling. Don't lie, the agent chuckled, shoving his shoulder with convincing familiarity. You would have forgotten I was coming anyway. Izuku flinched slightly, his muscles were tight and sore after spending the night in a hospital bed. She noticed. I'm sorry, Izuku, I forgot you were so sore. Let's get you home. She waved goodbye to the nurse and ushered him to the elevators. Izuku was in and out of the hospital often enough that he had a routine for when he finally got home. First, eat whatever Kaken had cooked for him and left on his counter. Second, take a bath to get the smell of antiseptic out of his skin. Third, take a few sleeping pills and pass out for at least 12 hours. None of that seemed likely to happen today. He'd ridden home in the back seat of a town car while the agent sat up front, talking to the driver. Izuku assumed he was another agent given how his agent had relaxed when she saw him behind the wheel. The two had immediately started talking, first in English, then quickly switching into what sounded like one of the Romance languages when Izuku had leaned forward to listen in. Unlike Asuka, this new agent didn't seem to have much in the way of notable features besides being foreign. That alone would make him stick out in most places in Japan, but Mizudafu had enough tourists and businessmen that it wouldn't raise any eyebrows. Brown hair, eyes obscured by sunglasses, and a cheap suit, he looked like he'd been pulled out of the background of an American film. Izuku decided to call him Agent Smith. Once at Izuku's apartment building, Agent Smith unloaded what looked like groceries from the trunk, making a comment that made the green-haired agent chuckle. He accompanied them to Izuku's apartment, set down the groceries, and left without ever acknowledging Izuku. Who was he? Izuku asked. He slid his shoes off by the door, watching the woman cross the living room to the kitchen. He's my partner, the agent said as she started sorting through the groceries. He checked the bug sweep, set up the surveillance, all the behind-the-scenes stuff while I was picking you up. The groceries were a favor to me. Apparently your fridge was, she paused, the ghost of a chuckle crossing her face again, rather empty. I don't have time to cook. Between hero work, the Endeavor Agency's administrative work, and keeping up on training, Izuku was lucky he had time to sleep most days. What surveillance did you install? Don't worry, we used microphones and pressure sensors so there are no cameras. The agent didn't bother looking at him as she spoke. I'll walk you through it once I get the food put away. Izuku stood awkwardly by the doorway, listening to the unfamiliar clatter of someone else moving through his space. It felt invasive, wrong. With no better idea, he headed for the closest horizontal surface and collapsed onto the couch. Outside, the city pulsed with light and life, as if it hadn't even noticed its hero was gone. Izuku blinked and the world blurred. The first tear slipped free before he even realized he was crying. Then another. And another. Until he couldn't stop. He must have fallen asleep there, because the next thing he knew, a rough hand was shaking him awake. He sat up with a gasp, adrenaline scorching through his veins. Just me, nerd. Kaken was in his street clothes, but the flecks of leftover grease paint around his eyes announced he'd just gotten off patrol. He was holding a small tray with a large dish of noodles, a teapot, a cup, and a couple different tea bags laid out. Izuku was pretty sure he hadn't had any tea in his house. He definitely didn't have a variety of it. Agent Smith must have bought it with the groceries. What do you want? Izuku asked, not bothering to sit up from where he lay. The agent didn't want to wake you up, the other hero answered. He set the tray down on the coffee table. But you need to eat. What's the point? Izuku asked himself, trying to ignore the hungry twist in his stomach. But what are you doing in my apartment? Checking in, Kaken said. It seemed he took the question as an invitation, because he sat down on the couch next to him. Wanted to make sure that you hadn't annoyed the agent into killing you herself. We can't have that, can we? Izuku said flatly. The despair that had gripped him earlier was gone now, replaced by a dull, heavy numbness. His childhood dreams had slipped from his grasp and he couldn't even muster the energy to be angry. Maybe it was always going to end like this. He'd been on borrowed time since he was 14. Sooner or later, it had to run out. You were a hero before the Quirk, always charging in to save people. Kaken's voice had that ugly soft tone again. That's why All Might picked you. The slime villain incident, where it had all started. Izuku chuckled dryly as he recalled Kaken's screams of rage when he'd run into the fray to help, useless hands digging at the slime in a fruitless attempt to free him. It had been easy to act like a hero when he was too young to understand the risks. These days, if he saw some kid rush into a fight the way he had, he wouldn't be impressed. He feels sick. When you're quirkless, it's called being an idiot. I can't save anyone like this. Izuku lifted his arms straight in front of him. His fingers were crooked, broken more times than he could count. There was more scar tissue than untouched skin, the cost of doing hero work. Izuku flicked his fingers up at the ceiling. Kaken flinched as he did, as if he expected the ceiling to cave in. His oldest friend looked away from him, fidgeting with his sleeve. They'll get it back. Aries got a good grasp of her quirk. Once they figure out the mechanism, she'll be able to undo it. Izuku sat up, finally. They were sitting shoulder to shoulder now, looking out at the sun setting over the city. And if they don't? He expected silence. Or worse, sympathy. Katsuki Bakugo didn't do anything halfway, and he definitely didn't carry dead weight. Izuku had spent the last 7 years watching him work with a single focus, saying no to everything that might have made him happy if it didn't make him better. Romance, friends, peace, all sacrificed on the altar of being the best. If Izuku wasn't an asset to their agency, Izuku wasn't going to be part of it, childhood friend or not. But Kaken just shrugged. Then we'll figure it out, he said, speaking more to the city than him. You're not getting out of this that easy. Izuku looked over at the other hero. He wanted to believe him, but even now he heard Kaken's voice in the back of his head. Pathetic loser. You'd be better off taking a swan dive off the building and hoping you were born with a quirk in your next life. Yeah. He forced his expression into a smile. We'll figure it out. Katsuki waited until the apartment door had fully closed behind him before he let out a groan. That hadn't gone as well as he'd hoped. Maybe it was the shouting match before the accident, maybe the one after, but he could tell that something had shifted. It had been a few years since Deku used that fake smile on him. It was usually reserved for the press or, on occasion, a particularly difficult sponsor. After years of partnership, Katsuki had thought they had some level of intimacy. Not too close. The marks he'd left on Deku's psyche so many years ago weren't easily healed, but close enough that they could talk to each other. Apparently not. Katsuki swallowed the emotions building in his throat. Bottling things up wasn't healthy, but neither was ruminating on something he couldn't change. All okay? Katsuki jumped. The agent had appeared next to him without a sound or sight to warn of her approach. Yeah, peachy, Katsuki grumbled. The agent didn't move from his elbow. Her expression was disconcertingly similar to the one Deku had when he was sizing up a villain. Shouldn't you be inside? He glared at the agent. He was one inconvenience away from blowing something up. He'd really been hoping for a fight on patrol, something rough that would take the edge off the pressure building in his chest, but he hadn't gotten it. He needed a meal, a nap, and a good hour with an explosion-proof punching bag. He didn't need was some government-sponsored extra staring at him like he was a science experiment. What is your relationship with Izuku? She asked bluntly, ignoring his question. Katsuki bit back a retort. He didn't need her complaining to the commission about insubordination. He was on thin ice as it was. He's my friend and business partner. That's all. Yeah, that's all. Katsuki could see she didn't trust him. The agent's face was remarkably inscrutable, but hardly more so than Shudo's. He could see the slight twitch of her eyebrows, the tightness at the corners of her mouth. Okay, she said, apparently deciding pushing the subject was not worth the effort. I wanted to go over some ground rules while you're here. Could you come inside? He hated the sound of that. Could we do that some other time? He asked, heading for the stairs. Or never. Never would be good too. The agent stepped in front of him, blocking his path. On theory, there wasn't much someone who's 5 foot something and under 50 kilos could do to stop him if he actually tried. But she did have the authority of the commission around her shoulders, and that was a brick wall he couldn't blast through. There's only one. The agent crossed her arms. You need to let me do my job. No treating Zuka differently, no hanging around here, no random midnight check-ins. Katsuki scowled at the last part. One time. It happened one goddamn time, and Deku had a shattered collarbone, so it wasn't like it was for no reason. Still, he had no clue how the agent even knew about it. The file on Deku must be one hell of a read. He blinked, realizing the agent was staring at him, clearly waiting for a response. Fine, he said. But on one condition, we spar. The agent chewed the inside of her cheek. Absolutely not. Katsuki matched her posture, eyes narrowed. Look, if you can't beat me, you've got no shot against the kind of freaks that come after him. It was probably unfair. His quirk hit harder than most of the villains she'd face in her job, and bodyguards were supposed to extract their target, not subdue the attacker. But this wasn't some ambassador with a death threat. This was Deku. If there was someone in danger, he'd run towards it and go through anyone trying to stop him. Any agent trying to pull him out was going to have a fight on their hands, and Katsuki needed to know she could handle that. The agent eyed him, a mirror image of Deku when he was weighing the options before a mission. If you want to see how I operate in the field, I'll need to use my gear. You get yours, I get mine. That's fine, the agent said. Katsuki was surprised. The agent wasn't willing to fight him without gear, but she was fine going against him fully armed? For most people, that was a death wish. How about tomorrow morning? The next morning, Katsuki headed to the office early. He'd been itching to let loose for a while, and gear or no gear, he wasn't planning to pull his punches. He didn't do half-butted, and these days he needed a good fight like he needed air. Kirishima being stationed out in Joku didn't help. Katsuki hadn't seen his best friend in way too long. He missed the dumbass, sure, but right now he mostly missed having someone he could launch across a room without thinking twice about it. No need to hold back, no need to explain. Old habits die hard, and just because he had healthy coping mechanisms these days didn't mean he'd turned into a goddamn saint. Katsuki headed to the second floor of the building, where his and Deku's offices were. To his surprise, Deku was already there, his office light pouring into the still dark hallway. "What are you doing up?" Katsuki asked, leaning against the doorframe. Deku looked up from his work. "What do you mean? I'm always here this early." "You just got out of the hospital. Figured you might sleep in." Katsuki paused, glancing around the office. There was a conspicuous lack of someone. "Where's your, better safe than sorry with the whole cover thing? Cousin?" "She's around here somewhere, probably checking out the security measures," Deku said, turning back to his work. Katsuki noticed he was playing with a new watch. A gift from the agent, no doubt. "What are you doing here? You're not usually in your office until after 7. The agent hadn't told him. Katsuki chewed the inside of his cheek, debating whether or not to tell Deku about the mash. He hadn't planned on it, but, as a rule, they didn't outright lie to each other. When he learned about the match, Deku would insist on tagging along, and that meant Katsuki would get an earful about fighting an amateur, trained or not. The agent was no hero, in full gear. "I have a sparring match." Katsuki gestured to his gear bag. "The truth, if not all of it." "Oh, I didn't know Kirishima was in town." "He isn't." "Well, here it goes. It's with your cousin." Deku stood so quickly he jostled his desk, a familiar look in his eye. Katsuki knew better than to get between Deku and a chance to study a new quirk. "You want to come along?" The other man bounced next to Katsuki, already muttering to himself as they walked to the gym. The creases between his eyebrows were gone for the first time since this whole thing started. "You're going to go easy on her, right?" Deku asked as they rounded the corner. Katsuki scoffed. "No." Deku frowned. "She's clearly not trained as a frontline fighter. You'll knock her out in a second." Katsuki smirked a little at the comment, some of his pride seeping out. He was pretty sure Deku was underestimating the agent a bit, but the vote of confidence felt nice. Laughter echoed from the door to the gym as they approached. Katsuki frowned. He'd locked the door last night. The only people with keys were him, Shudo, and Deku. He glanced at Deku, who shrugged. "Well, might as well make an entrance." Katsuki kicked the door open harder than necessary, the sound echoing through the large space. To his surprise, the trespassers didn't scatter. The agent and a stranger stood in the center of the room on some of the mats usually kept in a corner, like they'd been sparring. They looked distinctly mismatched. The stranger had a good 20 kilograms and at least 13 centimeters on the agent. Whatever they'd been doing, they had stopped and were looking at him and Deku. After a moment of stiff silence, Katsuki spoke. "How the F did you get in here?" "We were just warming up," the agent said, avoiding the question as she walked towards the bench. The stranger, a foreigner about his height, didn't move. "Who is he?" Katsuki asked bluntly, gesturing towards the stranger. The agent glanced over her shoulder as if asking for permission. He simply crossed his arms. She shrugged. "He's my partner. I call him Agent Smith," Deku piped up. "I'm not sure he speaks Japanese." "He does." The agent picked up a water bottle from the bench and turned to Katsuki. "I just need to suit up. Are you ready or did you want to warm up?" "Suit up?" Deku asked, looking from the agent to Katsuki. "Yeah, we're sparring with gear," the agent said. Deku's eyebrows furrowed. Katsuki could feel a lecture coming about not beating the sheet of strangers just because they were stupid enough to let him, exactly why he hadn't planned to tell the other man about the match in the first place. "Katsuki, I don't think Dash. She'll be fine." The foreign agent sat down next to Deku. His Japanese had a heavy accent, but it wasn't the worst Katsuki had heard. Up close, he could see why Deku called him Agent Smith. The man didn't have a single distinguishing characteristic. Even his gym clothes were boring, no logos, no designs, no color. "I'm good to go," Katsuki said, already pulling his gauntlets out of his duffel. We'll need to move the mats though, they're a fire hazard. Okay. The agent nodded to Agent Smith. As he attached his gauntlets, Katsuki watched as the agent began pulling on her gear. It reminded him a bit of Shudo's uniform. An armored vest, a utility belt with a few unfamiliar implements, a thin fabric mask. He wasn't entirely sure what he was going up against. Not that it mattered. He could handle whatever she threw at him. Okay, I'm ready. Katsuki raised an eyebrow. You sure? You're already at a disadvantage. The agent laughed. I've fought tougher quirks than yours. I don't know, Deku commented from that bench. His quirk is pretty strong and he's not good at pulling punches. The warm pride returned. Didn't right he wasn't good at pulling punches, he didn't hand a win over to anyone. Seriously, Zuko? The agent sounded a little exasperated. I'm good at my job. I can protect you even from Kaken here. Katsuki started at her use of the nickname. Kaken. Years of public appearances and paparazzis with long-range mics had broken Deku's habit of using the childish name. He still used it among their friends, but Katsuki doubted he counted the agent as one. There was a flicker of something between fear and embarrassment across the agent's face. It's what Zuko called you. Yeah, and only him. Katsuki glared at the agent. She must have read the name in a file somewhere. Deku had called him that all through their first year at UA. It wasn't a secret. Still, it felt weird to hear the name come from another person's lips. Or it should have. The agent shrugged, face emotionless again. Then? Katsuki frowned. It was way too familiar for his liking, but it was better than the alternative. So, how about Bakugu and we pretend that we weren't that close? The agent gave him a withering look. He guessed that option was out. Hey, so what's your quirk? Deku interrupted. Your gear doesn't really reveal anything. Katsuki noticed Agent Smith's eyebrows rise slightly in surprise at the question, but he recovered quickly. Why don't you guess? I read you like doing quirk analysis, right? The agent suggested. That was a smart move. Katsuki didn't have to look at the other man to know Deku's face had lit up. Okay, Deku said, that might be really interesting. I could probably guess at least your basic quirk isn't combat-oriented since you wanted to fight with gear and... The agent looked a little confused, seemingly unsure whether Deku was still talking to her. He had spiraled into muttering, holding his chin and staring off into space. He's just thinking out loud, Katsuki said, walking past the agent to the center of the gym. We should get started. All right, said the agent, following him. Katsuki turned to face her, his gauntlets comfortingly heavy on his. They packed a hell of a punch, and he wasn't sure if the agent's body armor would do much against it. Still, she seemed to think she was up for it, and he wasn't going to turn down the chance at a good fight. You ready? He asked. The agent nodded. Deku, count us down, he shouted, loud enough to startle Deku out of his muttering. Oh, okay. 3, 2, 1. Deku swung his arm like a starting flag. Fight! Katsuki lunged forward. Quirks were great and all, but in close quarters the simplest strategy was usually the best. The agent dodged, leaping almost 6 meters to his right. Okay, that was new. As Katsuki's eyes followed his target, he could see one of the unfamiliar implements, a small silver ball, leave the agent's fist. There was a flash as Katsuki extended his arm to follow the agent. What the F dash? His explosion didn't come. On instinct, he looked back to his hand. There was a quiet thud and cloud of dust surrounded him. He could feel the particles hit his skin and SCK up the moisture there. The agent had neutralized his quirk, for the moment at least. Katsuki wheezed a little as he coughed up the dust. His eyes were watering, clouding his vision. He caught sight of the agent's kick just before it landed. He blocked, pushing her back. When her feet hit the floor, the agent bounced back up into the air. He tried to track her, looking up. His hand wouldn't spark, but he could still throw a punch. The agent didn't try to land a hit. Instead, she landed on his shoulders, knees first. The force made him stumble back, falling onto the floor. Katsuki had not expected to be on his back less than a minute into the fight. He was covered in dust, the wind knocked out of him, on his back. He moved to push her off. He just needed a split second to get the upper hand. The agent caught his wrist, slipping her fingers into the cuff of his gauntlet and pressing the tiny button that no one but Katsuki, God, and his support gear designer should know existed, the emergency release. The element of surprise was a beach. The gauntlet opened. As if in slow motion, Katsuki saw her catch the gauntlet on her opposite forearm, clicking it shut around her own wrist. For the first time in recent memory, Katsuki Bakugo was looking down the barrel of his own weapon. He was a little impressed, both by her training and her contacts. Those schematics weren't exactly available. The agent had grabbed the pin, but didn't pull. She was kneeling over his chest, in unstable position. He could easily throw her off. Any blast from the gauntlet would throw her across the room. The kickback was no joke. He flexed his palm, feeling the sparks dance around his fingers. Katsuki saw the agent's finger tighten on the pin. He hadn't been wearing the gauntlet long, the blast would be weak. She didn't have his experience or muscle memory, so even the smallest shift in her position would send the blast wide. Katsuki smirked. The agent could read schematics all day, but no one knew his weapons better than him. This was the split second he needed. He pushed himself up from the ground with one arm, grabbing for the gauntlet with the other. The explosion went wide, missing him entirely and throwing the agent back. Katsuki stood, wiping his palms on his pants to clear off any of the remaining dust. He blasted across the gym in seconds, catching the agent's arm while she was still in midair and using their combined momentum to throw her into the ground. There was a satisfying thump as she hit the floor. She rolled in an attempt to avoid the full force of the impact, and landed in a crouch. If she was smart, she'd call the match now. Katsuki wasn't betting on it. He was starting to get the feeling she was as crazy as Deku. As if she could hear his thoughts, the agent sprinted to his left, his gauntletless side, and, with an almost comical stomp, launched herself back towards him. He moved to meet her, catching the shine of another bauble in her hand as he did. They met in midair again. He caught her wrist, stopping her from activating whatever it was that suppressed his quirk. The movement left his side open and the agent saw it. Her knee made contact just before they hit the ground. Katsuki stumbled forward, keeping the grip on the agent's wrist. It was taking an embarrassing amount of concentration to avoid doubling over and vomiting over the gym floor. The knee to his side had left her off balance, and it was easy enough to use the momentum from the fall to shove her face first against the wall. Good, she'd tap out and... The FANG agent threw her head back in an attempted headbutt. He dodged, but the movement loosened his grip and allowed the agent to twist out of his hold. She reversed their positions, a move that only worked because half his brain was still trying to keep the bile down, trapping his wrists against the small of his back. Katsuki could count on one finger the number of people who could get him into this situation, Deku. If he found out that Deku helped the agent get ready for this, he would actually kill him, Quirk or no. No matter how angry the other man was at him, some things were meant to stay between them. He flexed his palm. If it had been Deku behind him, he knew exactly what he would do. He hesitated for a second. Signing up for a spar against him in uniform wasn't the same as volunteering for a close-range explosion to the stomach. Plus, she needed to be able to protect Deku's dumb butt after this. You ready to tap out? Katsuki could hear the grin in her voice. Well, that settled it. He mentally crossed his fingers that the body armor was fireproof as he let a spark fly. The force of the explosion shoved him harder into the wall but sent the agent flying backward. He turned, still leaning against the wall because, he needed to catch his breath. He could see Deku yelling at him, though he couldn't hear him around the implanted earplugs that had expanded. Katsuki grimaced. It wasn't his fault, he'd even used the hand without a gauntlet being the good guy that he was. He grumbled as he pushed himself off the wall, shivering as the implants shrunk back against his ear canal. He'd never get used to the feeling. The agent was splayed out on her back in the center of the gym. As he approached to see if she was okay, again because he was a good guy, he could see the agent's chest rise and fall rapidly, like she was gulping for air. The lower portion of the vest had a deep crack in it, but it hadn't burned away. Surely she'd call it. His opponent rolled onto her side, glaring up at him. It wasn't the look of surrender. He'd seen that look 100 times and almost all of them were followed by one of Deku's shoot-style kicks aimed at his head. Oh, come on, he groaned. He was going to put the agent into the hospital before she tapped out. Rolling his neck, Katsuki shifted his weight into a fighting stance again. Lay's tumor. Agent Smith was walking towards them, shouting at the agent, with Deku trailing behind. Katsuki couldn't understand rapid French, but he understood the look of fed-up worry that was on the foreign man's face. The agent rolled back onto her back with a huff, starfishing out on the floor. Katsuki took the tacit surrender and walked over. He offered his hand to the agent as Agent Smith approached. The agent took it, letting him pull her up. "Good enough?" she asked breathlessly, resting her hands on her knees. "Yeah," Katsuki said. "You'll do." Not 30 minutes later, Katsuki paced the hall as he waited for the agent to come out of the locker room. He knew there was something about the fight, something about the way Agent Smith's expression had changed when Deku mentioned quirks, some things that all pointed in the same direction. He needed to know if he was right because if he was, the agent had been lying to since she'd arrived. The sound of the locker room door swinging shut snapped Katsuki to attention. "Oi," he said to the agents retreating back. She stopped short and turned to face him. "Where's Zuko?" she asked, her voice wary. "Probably his office," Katsuki answered, walking towards her. "I need to talk to you." "Okay." The agent's face tightened and she shuffled, biting the edge of her lip. "What's up?" Katsuki pressed his lips together. He wanted to say this right. "You gonna tell Deku you're quirkless, or what?" The agent grimaced. "Okay," he hadn't said it right. "I don't see why my quirk status is any of either of your dash." "Look," he cut her off. "I'm not dash," he huffed, looking up at the ceiling. "I know you're good at your job. I can count on one hand how many people can hold their ground against me. But quirks are kind of Deku's thing. If he realizes you've been lying to him." "I'll tell him if it comes up," the agent interjected. Katsuki met the agent's eyes. "He's asked about your quirk a couple of times now." "Yup," the agent said, popping the last consonant. "He's asked what my quirk is, not if I have one." Katsuki clicked his tongue in a scoff. Now that was just semantics. The agent sighed. He seems to have an issue with people without quirks doing this kind of work. She shifted her bag up on her shoulder and glared up at him as if daring him to contradict her. "I didn't want to create unnecessary issues." Katsuki shoved his hands into his pockets. He knew exactly where Deku's feelings about quirks came from. Sure, Katsuki'd been a kid at the time and was mostly parroting the prejudices of the adults around him, but the damage his bullying caused had proved to be permanent. There was a part of him that wondered what would have happened if some other kid had lived next to Deku. A Deku with his confidence intact and a supportive friend would have almost certainly been a success, revolutionized support gear, or created a new way of understanding quirk evolution, the kind of work that had ripple effects across the world, not just Japan, the kind of work with negligible fatality rates and holidays off. "It's not his fault," he said. "His quirk came in late after middle school. I gave him a lot of shit for being quirkless when we were kids." The agent stared at him, mouth slightly open. Her eyes were wide and for the first time since he'd met her, the expression stuck. He waited for her to say something, maybe a comment on him being an a-hole, but she didn't. She just opened her mouth, then closed it again, then repeated it. "You need to tell him. If you don't and he figures it out on his own, it'll be worse for you," he said finally. The agent huffed. "Are you sure that telling him wouldn't make this whole thing harder?" Katsuki shoved his hands even deeper into his pockets. If she'd asked him the same question a few days ago, he'd have sworn that Deku wouldn't give a shit about her quirk status. But last night he'd heard the echoes of his younger, stupider, angrier self in Deku's voice and he wasn't so sure. "You know him better than me, so I'll follow your lead, okay?" the agent said, starting down the hall. Katsuki saw her wince as she walked, favoring her left side where his explosion had hit her. A little guilt bubbled up, which set him off more than anything. She could have ended it when he'd pinned her, but didn't. That was on her. Katsuki didn't pull his punches for anyone. Which is why he was more than a little surprised at the next words that came tumbling out of his mouth. "I have a bruise salve that really helps with the swelling. If you want some for," he gestured vaguely to her side, "you know, I can bring it by Deku's apartment later." He couldn't see the agent's face, but she paused. Her fingers played with the strap on the gear bag. Thanks, Kaken, I'd appreciate that, the agent said. The nickname sounded so familiar coming from her mouth that Katsuki was starting to question his childhood memories. There was no way there had been another Midoriya slinking around the playground, let alone another Quirkless one, but the way she said it felt like it was an afterthought. Don't fucking call me that, he grumbled to the agents retreating back. Katsuki turned on his heel and headed into the locker room. He didn't do that kind of thing. He didn't let extras call him Kaken. He definitely didn't offer up Melissa Shields' salve to treat their injuries. Except he just did, like he'd done it before, almost a reflex. He clicked his tongue and leaned against the wall of lockers. It's because she needs to be in decent shape to protect Deku, he thought. That idiot was always going to find trouble. Even inside his own head, it sounded like bullshit. There was something about the agent that scratched at something old in him. He just couldn't put his finger on it. He wasn't sure he wanted to. Strictly, Q should have gone straight back to her protectee, shrugged off the spar, and gotten back to work. Instead she was sitting on a bench on top of the agency, trying to rein in the clusterfuck of thoughts bouncing around her skull. It was fine. Q had been assured several times by both Carter and Handler that the Endeavor agency was secure. Handler had even gone so far as to suggest she let Midoriya, Q was trying to force herself to think of him as just another protect, have a long leash when they were in the building to keep him happy and her cover intact. She almost wished that that wasn't the case. Being forced to play her role as bodyguard would give her something to concentrate on. Q had been sure that she could handle protecting this Izuku Midoriya. He was so different from her that it was easy to separate him from herself. She hadn't even thought about seeing Kaken. On a factual level, Q had known that this universe's Midoriya had teamed up with his Kaken, but she'd assumed that he would be different somehow. Less familiar. Instead, it had taken 3 seconds in his presence for Q to melt back into Izuku. She'd accepted the spar hoping for Kaken's approval. She'd refused to swallow her pride and call the match before it got out of hand. She'd called this Katsuki Bakugu, Kaken, twice. The last one might be the worst offense. The name had slipped out like the most natural thing in the world. Old habits die hard, but judging from the look on this Kakugu's face, she was positive that it was a name she shouldn't have known. This wasn't her Kaken. The conversation in the hallway had proven that. No way the Kaken that shoved her into lockers and burned her notebook would stand in front of a stranger and admit something was his fault. Hell, no way he'd let an extra get away with calling him Kaken unsinged. Perhaps it was time. This universe was a few years ahead of her own, so he must be well into his late 20s now. It was possible that the same time that honed his skills had tempered his anger. Maybe it was Midoriya. They clearly had a relationship of some kind that went beyond friend and business partner. Q swallowed, refusing to entertain the train of thought leading back to the day on the roof. She couldn't go back, and wallowing in her grief would only be a waste of her time. She was impossibly lucky to get another chance at any life, let alone one that included some version of Katsuki Bakugu that apologized, in so many words, for the damage he'd done. Q closed her eyes. The air had a slight chill, but the sun was warm on her face. The city buzzed below her, thousands of lives muddling their way through life alongside each other. The wooden bench was rough below her fingers, and she could feel the divots of initials scratched there by visitors who had come and sat here over the years. She had a good life, with its own challenges and joys. She wouldn't let a past that never happened put it in jeopardy. Midoriya was sitting in his office mumbling into a recorder when she rejoined him. Q waited in the doorway for him to finish his thoughts, watching the other heroes shuffle around the office. It was mid-morning, and it looked like shift change was starting. Q glanced around the room. The office was lined with solid bookcases, half of which were filled with well-worn notebooks. She wondered how many of them they had shared, and whether this version had ever improved his handwriting. The rest of the shelves were filled with awards, the shiny plastic glittering in the light from the wide windows. It was definitely an office that belonged to a top 10 hero. She still wasn't sure how he'd gotten his quirk. Judging by what Katsuki had told her this morning, he'd developed it the same year she'd opted out of her universe. Quirks that could be transferred were rare, but not unheard of. The existence of All for One proved that. It seemed like getting a quirk had kept this version from ever coming to terms with being born without one. I'm pretty much useless like this. Q could hear the echoes of Kaken's taunts in those words. It twisted her stomach into knots to hear them come out of their mouth. Worse, Midoriya really thought it was true. Bakugo was probably right about telling Midoriya, but Q wanted a chance to show this version just how wrong Kaken had been before she did. Midoriya finally noticed her by the door and gestured that she come in. "Leave it open," he said as she reached for the doorknob. "I don't close it unless I'm not here. I like to be accessible to my team." Not the best policy, but Q could probably handle that. It was better not to raise any eyebrows. "I have a couple meetings left this morning that I'm hoping you can help me with." Surely he wasn't asking her to give him her professional opinion here, in his office, door wide open. Midoriya waved some files in her direction. Some case files. That was exactly what he was doing. Q turned and shut the door. She saw Midoriya's wrist flick like he was trying to activate his quirk, as if by habit. When nothing happened, he grimaced. "Look," she said, walking to his desk and sitting down on the edge. "When we're out of the apartment, I'm your cousin. It doesn't matter who else is in the room. I don't call you Zuku all the time because I think it's a cute nickname. I do it because if I slip and call you Midoriya in public, someone might notice. This isn't about your feelings or your friends, it's about keeping you safe." Midoriya rolled his eyes. "And keeping my condition?" He practically spat the word, "a secret." Q sighed. There it was again, the rage at being forced back into the pitiful existence of being quirkless. She bit the side of her cheek to keep herself from saying something stupid. "That I don't care about." His vulnerability being common knowledge would make her job harder, but the agency didn't have a stake in whether the world knew that Japan's rising star was quirkless. "If you want to tell the whole world you're quirkless," she saw him flinch at the word, "that's not my problem. My job is to keep you in one piece. Mostly. If you're so obsessed with keeping your cover, I don't see why you sparred with Katsuki," he said. "That doesn't seem very cousin-like." He crossed his arms and leaned back, as if he'd cornered her. He wasn't wrong. Any rational agent would have told the explosive hero to go F himself, and Q was sure that Handler would be docking her paycheck for the destroyed vest. "I needed him to trust me to protect you," she lied. "The gym is sound and quirk-proof, so I doubt anyone even noticed we were in there." Q crossed her arms, mirroring his stance, and waited for him to argue. Midoriya didn't respond for a few minutes, seeming to debate whether he should push back again. They sat in silence for a moment. "I still haven't figured out your quirk," he said finally, changing the subject. Q swallowed. If Midoriya let his assumptions fall, it would be obvious. She was pretty sure Bakugo figured it out mid-spar. But this Midoriya couldn't fathom her existence without one. "You'll get there eventually," she muttered. There was a knock on the door. Midoriya glanced at the clock. "That'll be Uraraka," he said, standing. "Come in." The short brunette woman opened the door and stepped inside. "Oh, I'm sorry, Deku, I didn't know you were with someone." "No worries," Midoriya said. "This is my cousin, Asuka Midoriya." Q smiled brightly, approaching the anti-gravity hero. She bowed slightly deeper than necessary. "It's a pleasure to meet you, I've been a fan for years." "Ah, Deku, she looks just like you," Uraraka said happily. "I can't believe you haven't brought her around to say hello." "I've been a little busy lately," Midoriya said. "Partly with that case." He pointed to the file in Uraraka's hand. Uraraka sked, tossing the file at him. "Fine, I'll do it." Q sputtered, trying to talk the other woman out of it, but she dragged out of Midoriya's office before she even knew what happened. The Endeavor Agency was huge heroes working in most every specialty stacked on top of each other. Since the Big Three had taken it over, there have been a lot of staff changes, which had been pretty helpful when getting Carter's cover in place. Q did her best to match the tour with the blueprints she'd been briefed on. Luckily, Uraraka seemed less focused on the tour and more on introducing her to every sidekick, hero, and intern she could find. "Hey Todoroki!" Uraraka shouted at the double-quirked hero as he passed them in the hall. "Have you met Deku's cousin?" Shudo Todoroki, practically royalty in the pro-hero space, didn't seem surprised to see her there. He was taller than she'd expected, almost a head and shoulders over her, his two-toned hair pulled back in the kind of man bun that only someone with actual distaste for style would wear. "I haven't," he said. He gave Uraraka a sideways look. "Aren't you supposed to be out on patrol?" "I was, but then Tada dash," she gestured to Q like she was popping out of a cake. "Deku's cousin." "I'll take it from here," Shudo said. "Deku's off patrols for a couple more days, so I need everyone in the field." Uraraka pouted. "But Dash." "Cheeks," Bakugu's voice cut in. "What the hell? I've been waiting by the door for Dash." He paused when he saw Q. His eyebrows raised a fraction, then he smirked. "Oh, you found Suka." Q blinked. That name slid off his tongue like he'd been using it since elementary school. Maybe he deserved more credit for his undercover skills. "You've met her?" Uraraka asked. "Yeah, like 20 years ago." Bakugu strolled down the hallway and caught Uraraka's arm. "Can we go? We should take her on patrol." Uraraka chirped, now latching onto Q's arm like a determined koala. "Absolutely not," Todoroki deadpanned. "We do not have a waiver strong enough for that." "I bet she wants to see you in action," Uraraka pouted to Bakugu. "It's been at least a decade since she's visited, right?" "She saw me in action this morning, let's go." Q wasn't sure Bakugu had thought about how that could sound, but it looked like Uraraka took it at face value. Fine, Uraraka let Bakugu start to lead her away. "Wait, you took this morning off, how did she dash?" "Oh, she heard it." Bakugu immediately sped up, dragging her toward the elevator like he was trying to outrun the innuendo. She thought she heard a snicker from behind her. "Do you want to hide in my office in case anyone comes by?" Todoroki asked. "I'm sure you have better things to do than entertain the staff." "Yeah, sure." They walked to his office in silence. It was bigger than Midoriya's, with huge windows and a sitting area in the corner complete with a small drink stand. Q stood by the door a little awkward. Todoroki knew the barest details about the situation, just enough to avoid awkward conversations about access cards and pressing questions. "You really look like Midoriya," Todoroki said eventually. "That's going to mess with Bakugu." Q narrowed her eyes. "What's that supposed to mean?" Todoroki just shrugged. "We'll see." "T. Sure. Help yourself. It's alphabetized by flavor." The rest of her morning passed in companionable silence. The sun was setting when Izuku got home. It was the earliest he'd left the office in years, but there was only a small proportion of his work that he could do now. No point staying there to be useless. The agent had said they could walk home, his preferred mode of transportation, if he wanted to. Izuku took the offer, wondering if this was some attempt to get on his good side. When they entered the apartment, the agent headed straight to the kitchen. "I'll make dinner," she said, which was a relief considering the takeout ban and the fact that Izuku wasn't actually 100% sure how his stove worked. It was one of those huge fancy Western ones, so it wasn't exactly easy. Izuku hoped she could figure it out on her own. If she had any questions, he would have to call Kaken. Apparently, the agent had no questions because by the time Izuku had showered and changed, she was calling down the hallway that food was ready. As he walked to the kitchen, Izuku heard a knock on his front door. He frowned. He wasn't expecting anyone, and the agent hadn't told him that someone was coming. There was another knock, louder and more persistent. It sounded like Kaken. Izuku opened the door. As he expected, his old friend was standing in the hall. "Hey," Kaken said. He paused for a moment, sniffing the air. "Did you cook something?" "No, my babysitter did." "Good to know your stove is still running," the other man said. It sounded like he was trying to make a joke, but it fell flat. For a moment, Kaken shifted on his heels awkwardly, like he was waiting for Izuku to say something. Was he waiting for an invitation? "Did you want some?" Izuku asked. "Sure." Izuku stepped aside and let him into the apartment. They walked into the kitchen. There was no agent, but there were 2 plates of a simple curry set on the table. Izuku heard the sound of his guest bedroom door shut. It seemed the agent had wanted to give them privacy. Kaken took a seat, setting a brown paper bag on the table as he sat down. Izuku, curious, reached across the table and picked it up. There was a small tin inside, unlabeled and oxidized. To anyone else, it was innocuous, but Izuku knew immediately what it was. Melissa Shield sent this salve to you, he said incredulously. You guard that stuff with your life. Yeah, I felt a little bad about how rough the match got. Coming from Kaken, he may as well have fallen to his knees and begged the agent for forgiveness. You never offer it to me, Izuku griped. He could hear the whine in his own voice. Yes, he'd planned on lecturing the other hero about using his quirk to throw the agent across the gym, and yes, she probably could use something for the bruising, but some shade of annoyance sat heavy in his throat. It's not my fault you used up yours in a couple weeks, Kaken grumbled, not looking up from his plate. You get yourself hurt way too often. Izuku frowned. It's an occupational hazard. Kaken pushed his food around the plate for a minute. Izuku could see him running his tongue over his teeth, like he did when he was trying to find the right words. I just dash, the other man huffed, rising from the table. He walked over to the counters. Look, I lend it to Kirishima when he gets slammed or something, so I don't know why you're making a big deal of it. I'm not making a big deal, Izuku said, watching Kaken hunt through his cabinets. What are you doing? Where's that hot sauce I keep here? Kaken had now moved to the fridge. It's usually on the counter. The agent probably moved it when she put away groceries, Izuku said, turning back to his meal. Bodyguard, cook, personal shopper, there it is. Kaken pulled a small bottle from the fridge. Does she clean too? Why, you want her? Izuku quipped. He was getting tired of Kaken's seemingly unending praise for the woman. Kaken gave him an odd look as he sat down. Not particularly, but unlike some people he paused to add an inordinate amount of hot sauce to the plate, can feed myself. Izuku pouted as he pushed the curry around his plate. It tasted fine, he could tell that the agent had gone out of her way to make the sauce from scratch, but it didn't beat his usual order from the yakitori place down the street. So what's up? He asked after several minutes of silence. Kaken looked at him blankly. Why'd you come by? Was there an update about the laboratory thefts? Kaken swallowed his mouthful slowly. No, I just dash. He paused, tonguing his teeth again. The commission wanted an update on that bank robbery case. I know you were working on a theory about a quirk. Oh, right. Izuku stood, pushing aside his plate. He'd just gotten the security footage from the latest robbery last week, so he hadn't taken a proper look at it. Oi, finish your food first, Kaken said. I'm pretty sure you didn't have lunch. Izuku huffed, but sat back down. The other man wasn't wrong, though it wasn't like he'd done anything that would work up an appetite. Kaken seemed to notice his disappointment because he spent the rest of the meal peppering Izuku with questions about his theory until he was happily rambling about light waves and heteromorphic quirks. It wasn't until dinner was over and the dishes were washed, at Kaken's insistence, that the agent emerged from the guest room. She was wearing loose sweats, her hair piled up on her head. She made a beeline for the coffee maker. Oi, sucka. Kaken tossed the paper bag at the woman. She caught it easily. Thanks, she said, pulling the tin from the bag. This the salve you mentioned? Yeah. Great. The agent opened the tin and lifted her sweatshirt casually. Izuku winced in sympathy, splotches in various shades of red covered one half of her ribcage. He could see where Kaken's explosion had made contact, a particularly dark splotch about the size of his fist. As the agent dabbed on the salve, Izuku opened his laptop to pull up the security footage. Kaken slid his chair over next to him so they could both see the screen. It was familiar here, sitting at his kitchen table after work hours with Kaken. It felt almost like everything was back to normal. The screen glitched, Izuku noticed. He was turning to tell Kaken when the other man straightened and looked over his shoulder. Sucka, could you look at these? Kaken asked. It's security footage from a robbery. I'm wondering if you've seen something like it before. Izuku's lips pressed together as the familiar comfort vanished, replaced by a small twinge in his chest. He'd never seen Kaken willingly ask someone, let alone a new someone, for help. Yeah, of course, the agent said, not bothering to look up from the coffee maker. I'll be right there. The coffee maker whirred to life and Izuku took the opportunity to lean closer to Kaken. What are you doing? Izuku hissed. Getting some fresh eyes on this. Kaken didn't look away from the screen, pausing the footage and making a note. You've watched every other tape at least 6 times and haven't had a breakthrough. I don't think dash. Deku, we need to close this. Kaken pinched the bridge of his nose. If our agency's closure rate drops, with you out of the field dash. Fine, I get it. Izuku slumped back in his seat. He knew he could figure this out, he just needed more time. Kaken, however, had already decided leaving it to him was a lost cause. All okay? The agent asked, eyeing Izuku as she walked to the table, blowing on her coffee. Course, Izuku said. Katsuki was just telling me how much this case needed fresh eyes. Kaken clicked his tongue. Even without looking, Izuku knew he was rolling his eyes. The agent took a long sip of her coffee, resting her other hand on the back of Izuku's chair. So what's this footage you want me to look at? I can't guarantee I'll see anything. Analysts do most of this kind of thing when it's not in the field. Kaken shrugged. It can't hurt. Izuku turned his screen so the agent could see it. There's been a rash of robberies recently in our district, but we can't get this villain on camera. We think he had a light-bending quirk that renders him invisible, he explained. Witnesses have a uniform description of him, but there's nobody on the footage. He makes the workers touch everything, even carry it out of the store, so we haven't gotten any trace evidence. Huh, she said, taking a seat at the table on the other side of Izuku. He handed her his laptop and leaned forward, watching closely as she put the footage on 3x speed. So, if it's a quirk that affects cameras but not humans, it rules out, she started to say, her voice drifting into an unintelligible mumble as she studied the video. Kaken gave him a look as if to say, see how annoying that sheet is? Izuku shrugged. If this was what Kaken had been complaining about for the past 2 decades, Izuku was pretty sure it was a him problem. His phone vibrated in his pocket and he stood, checking the caller. The agent glanced at him, her mumbling stopping abruptly. It's Aizawa, he said, probably just wanting to check in. The agent nodded and went back to the screen, making a few tally marks on a corner of his notepad. Izuku stepped into the living room before answering the phone. Hey, sensei. Hello, problem child. Aizawa sounded tired, but no more so than usual. How's it going? It's good. Izuku settled on the back of the couch so he could sit and watch the agent and Kaken. She knows what she's doing. I heard Bakugo got his sparring match. Aizawa said. Yeah. She almost beat him, even with quirks, he replied. It was really impressive. She let him use his quirk? Aizawa asked, sounding surprised. I wouldn't have expected that. She doesn't usually like to fight people with combat quirks head-on. Yeah, Izuku mumbled, distracted by the way Kaken leaned over to point at something on the laptop screen. How much do you know about her? As much as anyone, I guess, Aizawa replied slowly. She's usually the one who gets called when I can't go in to neutralize a quirk or when the agency is helping out on an operation. He paused. She's unofficially specialized in hero agency ops because she's one of the few agents that can use eraser heads. Eraser heads? Is that the flashing thing? Izuku asked. Yeah, Aizawa said, sounding oddly proud. Hatsum and I worked for years to figure out how my quirk works so she could make a similar support item. The main problem is that unlike me, it takes out the quirk of anyone in range. So the user loses their quirk too? Izuku shifted on the counter, trying to get a better view of Kaken. It looked like he was leaning over towards Asuka and Izuku could feel the annoyance rising in his chest. If they have one, Aizawa answered. That's why only a few agents are certified. Eraserheads do serious damage if they're used on someone with a quirk too many times. Izuku went silent as Aizawa's words chugged through his mind. He replayed the sparring match through his head. Asuka hadn't used anything that he could recognize as a quirk the whole time. The realization suddenly hit him, so obviously he almost smacked himself in the face. She was quirkless. Hey, Midoriya? Aizawa's voice brought him back. You're muttering. Izuku could hear the shuffling of pots and pans in the background. If you're curious about the Eraserheads, you should ask Asuka about them. She probably has the schematics memorized by now. She's quirkless, Izuku whispered. Yeah, of course she is, said Aizawa calmly. I figured she told you already. It's part of why we wanted her on this. means she's not at a disadvantage if she gets infected. Izuku was silent, his voice caught in his throat. Problem child? The hand holding the phone went limp and fell into his lap. Izuku ended the call, his heart hammering. Katsuki had to have known, at least guessed. It was obvious looking back. Izuku stood, blood roaring in his ears. You're Quirkless? Izuku's voice bounced off the walls of the apartment. Kaken and the agent both jumped. Izuku could see a flash of guilt fly across the agent's face. Zuka-, she said calmly, but Kaken interrupted her. Deku, he said, standing and stepping in front of the agent. Izuku's stomach clenched. That proved it. Katsuki had known and said nothing. The same man who called Izuku useless for being Quirkless had said nothing. Kaken didn't even hesitate to step between him and the agent. He didn't even look at Izuku before taking a side. Izuku stopped short, blinking, the visual hitting his chest like a sucker punch. Seriously, Katsuki? He said, low and bitter. Kaken didn't flinch. Deku, calm down. You saw what she can do today and dash. I saw her lie to me, Izuku cut in, voice rising. I saw her fight you head on and I thought, wow, she's good. But I didn't know I was watching someone without a quirk practically throw themselves into traffic. He shook his head, backing a step away as his hands curled into fists. Kaken stepped toward him again, more cautious this time. I was going to tell you dash. When? Izuku snapped. When I got hurt. When she got killed. He turned toward the agent, chest heaving. I understand why you didn't tell me. It was need to know, mission priority, fine. But him. He pointed at Kaken, eyes burning. You know how dangerous it is to be Quirkless out here. You spend every day of our childhood pounding that into me. And you still put my life in her hands. Off, Deku. Izuku could see Kaken getting angry now. You know that's all bullshit. You of all people should can dash. He turned to stalk toward his room. Kaken grabbed his arm. And Izuku snapped. Katsuki, to his eternal shame, didn't see the punch coming. Just a bright pain as he stumbled back. He tasted the blood that dripped out of his nose before he felt it. He could tell nothing was broken, but there was no way he was going to let Deku get away with landing that hit. Deku dodged the right hook. The other man knew his starting move, but after years of spars and full-out fights, Katsuki had learned something too, Deku's counter. Sure enough, Deku went for the ribs. Katsuki caught his wrist mid-strike, twisted the arm behind his back, and locked it there. Calm the F down, he snarled. But Deku didn't listen. Of course he didn't. The heel of Deku's boot came down on Katsuki's foot hard, right on the pinky toe. Katsuki swore loudly, grip slipping just enough for Deku to twist free and spin around. They faced each other again, breathing heavy like they were 15 again on ground beta. Katsuki grimaced, sparks dancing around the tips of his fingers as almost an afterthought. The next time Deku came toward him, he'd end this. Then came the hiss of a canister. Cold mist hit his face. His knees buckled. He hit the floor hard, his limbs refusing to cooperate. Katsuki could feel Deku sagged against him. The agent squatted next to them, a black mask fixed sloppily over her face. Somehow, it made her look far more intimidating than she had moments ago. This, she said, brandishing the can before setting it on the floor, is a mild paralytic. She gently rolled Deku off him, positioning him on his side as she continued. It lasts 3 to 10 minutes, depending on your metabolism. Side effects can include vomiting, so I'm going to put you on your side too, okay? If waiting for a response, you should still be able to blink. Katsuki slowly closed his eyes, testing the theory. He could. Good job. The agent's eyes crinkled a little as if she was smiling. 2 for yes, 1 for no, okay? He blinked twice. Are you having any trouble breathing? She asked as she shifted his body onto its side. He blinked once. Good. Do you have any injuries besides your nose? 1 blink. Excellent. She shifted her weight and turned toward Deku, repeating the questions. Katsuki watched from the floor, seeing her expression soften as she glanced his way, almost like she sympathized. He didn't want sympathy. He wanted this to not be happening. The The adrenaline was wearing off, just enough to let the ache in his foot remind him where Deku's heel had landed. But that wasn't what made him want to scream. It was the way things always came back to this. One of them lashing out, losing it. The other stepping in and taking the hit. Worse, Katsuki had been trying to be better, trying to hold the line. And he was still getting steamrolled by the same bullshit patterns they'd been locked in since they were 15. The agent's voice cut through his spiral. "Okay, here's what I'm going to do," she said, directed at Deku. "I'm going to move you to your bed so that you're more comfortable. Bakugo is going to go home." Her tone sharpened. "Whether it's willingly or not is up to him. Is that okay?" Apparently Deku wasn't cooperating, shocker, because after a second the agent continued. "Option B is I leave you both here on the floor until it wears off. I will warn you, however, if you start fighting again, I will use this." She picked up the spray can again. "I have a full can. I can go all night." Deku must have agreed to option 1, because the agent stood up and said, "Excellent choice." Katsuki listened to the agent drag the other man across the floor. A few minutes later, the agent returned, mask around her neck, talking to, he assumed, Agent Smith. "Ways, les têtes de node et batterinal folate utiliser le vaporciteur," she said, voice low and clipped as she crouched beside him again. Her fingers were gentle as she wiped blood from under his nose with a tissue. He couldn't spot any kind of device, just 2 fingers in the hollow behind her jaw. She directed her attention to him again. "It should be starting to wear off. Could you try to wiggle your fingers for me?" Katsuki did, feeling the smallest movement in his hands. The agent nodded and returned her fingers to below her ear. "Non-levert. Ways, j'ai aussi." She lifted her fingers again. There must be a device there. The fake skin covering it was seamless. "Someone's going to relieve me, then I'll take you home." "Non, quelqu'un a besoin de prendre en charge ce soir." Her voice sharpened with command. Not asking. Telling. Katsuki grunted as he rolled to his stomach and got up on his elbows. Most of his body still felt like it had taken a nap under a weighted blanket, but he could move. Parce que j'lai dit, c'est tout. That tone. He knew that tone. He'd used that tone. The agent double-tapped the device and huffed. Katsuki pushed himself up from his elbows to a seated position leaning against the wall. "Don't try to stand," the agent snapped, the commanding tone still present. Katsuki grimaced. "Wasn't gonna." The agent raised an eyebrow doubtfully. "You know," he slurred around his heavy tongue, "I did say dash." "Shut up." The lock in the door clicked and the door opened. Agent Smith entered briskly. "Oh, est levert?" he asked the agent. "In his bedroom, I gave him something to help him sleep," the agent replied, walking into the guest room. Agent Smith glanced down at Katsuki and smirked. He snarled back out of habit. The other man's smirk widened. "En cholera ont pris un raclé encore une fois." Katsuki didn't speak the language, but he knew what mockery sounded like. "Be nice." The agent called from the guest room. "Pourquoi? C'est enfant gaiety dash." "Carter." So that was his actual name. Well, as close as Katsuki was going to get anyway. The foreign man frowned as the agent strode out of the bedroom, now wearing a hoodie and a backpack. "Tu enfant gate est un hero ici. Essaie de monter un peu de respect." Agent Smith, no. Carter's lips pressed together as she spoke as if he was trying very hard to not to say something. The agent's voice became softer as she touched his arm softly. "S'il te plaise." Katsuki could see the other agent's jaw clenched for a second, then his face relaxed. "Want me to get him up for you?" he asked, switching into his oddly accented Japanese and gesturing towards. Katsuki thought about protesting, but staying upright was hard enough. "Sure," said the agent. Carter squatted in front of him and hooked Katsuki under his arms, lifting him until he could stumble into standing. His balance wasn't great. It felt like he was trying to walk with both legs asleep. The agent stepped under one of his arms and helped him lurch out of the apartment. By the time they reached the elevator at the end of the hall, Katsuki was mostly walking on his own. "Mostly. You shouldn't have stepped in," he grumbled, pulling his arm off the agent and leaning his back against the wall of the elevator for support. The agent pressed the button for his floor. He didn't bother to ask how she knew where he lived. Fucking spies. Fists are how we communicate. I stepped in because you forget he lost his quirk, the agent said. She didn't look at him, keeping her eyes fixed on the indicator above the door. I saw your hand spark. Deku can handle it, Katsuki muttered, eyes shutting as the cool glass steadied him. The cold felt nice against his cheek. The agent bounced on the ball of her feet. Still. Nerd's been dodging my quirk since we were 6. She scoffed. Yeah, right. The elevator dinged. You okay to walk by yourself? Katsuki clicked his tongue in reply. He shoved off the wall and, well, his toes caught on the gap and he hit the floor hard. Perfect. When he rolled over onto his back, he saw her standing over him, her arms crossed, her face wearing that tiny smirk Deku had when he was trying not to laugh. She offered her hand. You sure you don't need help? He scoffed and grunted something offensive, but took her hand anyway. For a second her eyes widened as if she was surprised, but then she just smiled and pulled him to his feet. Come on, Kaken, she said too casually. Let's get you to bed. He should have corrected her, snapped, at the very least out of habit. Instead, he leaned against her shoulder and let her walk him to his apartment, wondering why the hell he didn't. Izuku woke up with a dry mouth and a headache. He was pretty sure the agent had drugged him after she moved him to his bed the night before. Sunlight streamed in between the crack in his curtains. His apartment was silent, just the whispers of central air and the fridge humming. Izuku closed his eyes, taking stock of his body. No injuries to speak of. His shoulder ached, though not as much as his pride. He was a hero, the best if you believe the rankings. Heroes didn't throw temper tantrums or punch their partners, or require an agent to. Well, heroes didn't require agents at all. Izuku sat up and stretched. Well, there wasn't much he could do now. He'd apologize, ask for a new agent, and move on. Then he could crawl into a bottle of single malt and try to forget how Kaken had stepped in between him and the agent, how quickly he defended her abilities and dismissed his concerns. Forget how he'd finally heard Kaken say that quirks didn't matter and that he hadn't been saying it about him. Izuku stood and padded towards the kitchen. He needed coffee. He needed food. He needed the agent out of his home, as far away from him and the danger that followed him as possible. He could pretend that that was for her own sake. Padding towards the kitchen, he nearly jumped out of his skin at the sight of someone sprawled on his couch. Morning, said Agent Smith casually. He was reading a paperback novel with a disturbingly cheerful-looking dog on the cover. What are you doing here? Izuku asked, suspicious. Agent Smith dog-eared his page and stretched like a cat. Your cousin figured you might react poorly if you woke up and saw her first. So she sent me. He smiled broadly. I'm the likable one. Izuku blinked. I need coffee. And I need your blood, Agent Smith replied. What? Need your blood. Agent Smith held up a little medical bag. For science. And a little bit for morbid curiosity. Izuku stared at him. You're kidding. I'm really not. He was not caffeinated enough for this. Agent Smith was setting the supplies on the kitchen island when Izuku walked over with a fresh mug of coffee. Hop up, Agent Smith said, patting the granite. On my kitchen island? Izuku asked, a little incredulous. Got a better place? Izuku looked around. He did not. With a sigh, he set his coffee down and scrambled onto the granite. This feels very undignified. You punched your supposed best friend in the face last night, Agent Smith said flatly, wrapping a tourniquet around Izuku's bicep. You're already firmly in the undignified category. Izuku flinched. That. He swallowed, suddenly intent on staring at his kitchen backsplash. What's this for? Whatever took your quirk is something we've never seen before. Documenting if and how it changes over time is pretty important. It's bloodborne, so. Agent Smith held up a test tube. We need your blood. Agent Smith inserted the needle with clinical ease. So, you were saying my partner's bad at her job? Izuku scowled. I didn't say that. Guess you were thinking it really hard. I just don't think it's safe to have her on this mission, he muttered. She's quirkless. She didn't tell me. Katsuki knew, and he didn't tell me either. Scandalous, Agent Smith muttered, snapping the first tube into place. An undercover agent didn't disclose sensitive personal information during an operation. Izuku gave him a look. Agent Smith actually rolled his eyes. She didn't lie to you because she didn't trust you. Then why? Agent Smith shrugged. Because she's a professional. Because the mission mattered. Because she knew you'd freak out. I did not freak out, Izuku muttered. You punched your best friend in the nose and had to be chemically sedated. Izuku snorted a little. Had to was a bit strong. You're an idiot if you want her off the job. The words hung in the air. Agent Smith sounded so sure. I've been hospitalized more times than I can count, and that was with my quirk. I barely survived half those fights, and I had one of the strongest quirks in existence. Yeah, you did, Agent Smith said simply, setting down the current tube and grabbing a third. Last one. Why are you so confident she's not gonna get hurt? Agent Smith finally looked up from his work. When people think they're invincible, they act like it. Take yourself, would that accident have happened if you'd known you were Quirkless? Izuku hesitated. No. I never would have let him get behind me. Exactly. Your cousin has never had the illusion of invincibility. She's had to adapt. She did adapt. Agent Smith removed the last test tube and the needle. He pressed a cotton ball to his arm, frost creeping over the edge of his fingers at the cotton turn cold. It was soothing. She's on another level when it comes to understanding quirks, Agent Smith continued. Especially in combat. She can break one down mid-fight and find a way to neutralize it. And she can do the opposite too, take a seemingly useless quirk and make it lethal. Agent Smith was so sure. It was a tough pill to swallow. All his life, Izuku had seen Quirkless as synonymous with Powerless. That had been the narrative, especially growing up in Kaken's shadow. People without quirks didn't get to be heroes, to save lives. Some part of him still believed that. Maybe his discomfort had less to do with the agent and more to do with her going against everything his subconscious believed. Agent Smith placed a bandage over the cotton ball and packed away the tubes. She doesn't need a quirk to be effective, Agent Smith said. She never has. And this isn't a test to see if she can keep up. This is her job. She's already passed it. Izuku exhaled slowly. Agent Smith stepped back, gesturing for Izuku to descend from the island. Don't let whatever past you have with Bakugo mess with your head, other. Izuku looked down into his coffee. It was cold now. He hadn't even tasted it. Let me think about it. Great. Agent Smith glanced at the mug and sighed. The coffee started to steam again. You can manipulate temperature? Izuku asked. Yeah, only about 15 degrees up or down though unless it's a really good thermal conductor. I mean, I could see how that could be really useful. Just temperature shock alone could dash. You can tell me about it in the car. Agent Smith cut off his ramble. Get dressed, we've got to go to work. Izuku walked into the agency. Just like yesterday, it felt like he'd walked into some slightly deviant version of his life. Everything was the same, the patrols, the paperwork, the everything, except for him. He shrugged it off easier this time. Agent Smith left him in the foyer to go do whatever it was he did. Izuku went to his office. The only thing he really had to do was the all-hands meeting with Shudo and Kaken. They needed to tell their employees that Izuku would be taking a small step from working in the field due to his injuries from his fall. The incident had been on every news channel in the days since, so it wouldn't be a tough sell. Still, Izuku dreaded lying to his coworkers. Almost as much as he dreaded having to face Kaken. He wasn't entirely sorry for last night. The other hero should have told him about the agent's condition, but it had been years since they'd actually come to blows during a fight. Morning, Deku. Ochako had appeared at his side. No Midoriya-chan today? Izuku startled. Not today. He thought about making an excuse, but he didn't know if the agent was planning on reappearing, so he figured it was best to stay vague. Oh, Ochako made a face, like she was putting pieces together. I'm sure she'll be around once Bakugo gets back from his patrol. What do you mean by that? Izuku asked. Ochako smiled. Just a guess. She patted his arm. I'll see you at the meeting. Izuku sighed and walked up to his office. He still had the month's worth of paperwork he'd put off to do. Didn't need a quirk for that. He unlocked the door to his office and flicked on the lights. Morning, Izuku. The agent was sitting on his desk. Not on. It looked like she'd cleared away the papers into neat stacks, but the sight still twisted his stomach. She'd made herself at home, in his office, in his Casey, his friend. What are you doing here? He asked. I wanted to talk about last night. He shut the door behind him. The anger that had settled was starting to build again. Look, I'm sorry. The words made Izuku stop. I was aware of your past with Bakugo and made a calculation. Bakugo made the point that keeping it from you would cause bigger issues, and he was right. I should have listened to his concerns. Katsuki wanted to tell me? Yes. He made the connection during our spar. The agent met his eyes without flinching. It was at my insistence that he didn't tell you. Izuku was feeling slightly more guilty about the punch. And the stomp. That doesn't change the facts, he said. You're quirkless. The agent's lips tightened into a thin line. Yes. So I'm not sure whether you can protect me. I understand your trepidation. The agent's voice was so flat it was almost robotic. So I brought you some reading. She picked up a thick folder from beside her and held it out. This is a summary of my missions while I've been working in Japan. Heavily redacted, of course, but I think it will make the point. If that was a summary, Izuku could imagine that the reports would fill a file cabinet. How long have you been working in Japan? The agent was clearly younger than him. He had a hard time believing that she'd managed that much work in the 5, maybe 6, by his guess, years she would have been active. 3 years. Izuku didn't bother to hide his surprise. How do I know what's in the file is accurate? I'm sure you'll recognize at least a few of the incidents. She slid off his desk. If you still don't trust something, call Aizawa. And if I still think you shouldn't be on the job? The agent gave a tight-lipped smile. Honestly, Izuku, it's not your call. That, she gestured to the folder, is a gesture of good faith, not a resume. Izuku frowned. The commission wouldn't let an unqualified agent stay on as my protection. They wouldn't. Thank God they have me. The agent brushed past him as she walked to the door. I'll see you tonight. The message was clear, he wasn't getting rid of her. Izuku sat down at his desk and opened the folder. He started to read. At first, it felt like reading an oddly formatted spy novel, all code names and redactions. But soon, patterns emerged. There were victories. A solo infiltration of an insurgent cell that ended in 3 arrests and 0 civilian casualties. A protection detail for a witness that lasted 5 days without any backup, despite a compromised safehouse and malfunctioning comms. But not everything was a win. One file documented a failed extraction. There were 2 casualties, too many moving parts, and not enough support. The agent's report didn't hide from it. She took responsibility for choosing the shorter route, the one she'd hoped would minimize risk. But hadn't. He could see the grief between the lines, the guilt. Another case detailed a reconnaissance operation that was blew up, quite literally. The agent made it out alive only because her partner refused to follow protocol and leave her behind. The failures weren't buried. They weren't downplayed. They were dissected. Each misstep followed by pages of tactical analysis, adjustments and alternatives she should have considered. There was a handwritten note in the margin: don't overestimate your silence. Assume detection. Build in redundancy. Izuku paused at that. He recognized the handwriting. Aizawa's. The more he read, the more something shifted in him. She wasn't trying to prove she was invincible. She wasn't pretending to be perfect. She was proving she knew she wasn't and planned accordingly. That unsettled him more than blind confidence ever could. She was viscerally aware that she was putting her life on the line every time. And still, she showed up. Mission after mission, she adapted. When she failed, she didn't let pride cloud her assessments. She adapted again. Izuku leaned back in his chair, rubbing the bridge of his nose. He was starting to understand why Agent Smith was so confident. The discomfort twisting in his chest wasn't about her ability, if it ever was. It was about the realization that she was everything he used to believe a quirkless person could never be. She had failed. And she'd stayed in the fight. He looked down at the thick folder again, the final report still unread. He thought back to his middle school self, how he would have taken the file and thrown it in Kaken's face. It was vindication over a decade too late. Izuku closed the folder, stood, and went to make a fresh pot of coffee. The agent could stay. He owed his past self that much at least,